Hey everyone.
Okay, welcome back. Those of you that have already joined us, remember to make sure you rename yourself the appropriate name, so you add participant in front of your name if you haven't already done so. And then if you also joined via the app and it added your school and your school is still showing, you can kick your school out, or it may just go out in just a moment anyways.
So were we thinking libraries first, or what do you guys want to do? That's just what I heard.
I was
That
thinking
sounds good.
college speakers first, but either one works.
Whatever. Doesn't matter to me. I was just wondering.
Yeah, I'm
I
cool
would
with that.
Yeah, library sounds good.
Okay.
From somebody's alarm going off in the background, because that's the same alarm that I use to wake up. And so whoever just had their timer go off.
That was mine to remember to join the Zoom.
Okay, good afternoon again. Those of you that already heard this and you've already fixed it, you can disregard, but a reminder, make sure your name is consistent and that you have named yourself participant and then your name following that so you don't get kicked out in the middle of the round. Let's see, are we missing anyone still? Yes. It looks like we're missing a couple people. Look at the list. We still have time. Do we have Rodriguez? Ah, there you are.
I'm here, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, there's Burkhardt. Yes. Okay, that might be everyone. Okay, it looks like we have everyone. We'll wait for Mazumdar to be on camera with us, but we still have a couple minutes before the round officially starts. Everybody doing okay? Did you take a break? Walk around your house at least, make a couple laps, get moving. Good. Okay. Anybody have any questions before we start? No. Good. Well, hopefully our technology continues to work as it did last round. Went pretty well for us. So hopefully it will continue on smooth sailing. So. Okay, in this round, we know that Representative Ontiru is going to be our presiding officer. So really, I'll turn it over to you and you can start when you're ready if you want to explain gaveling or anything before we officially begin.
All right, I thank Madam Parliamentarian, and at 2:58 p.m., I now call the session to order. My name is Senator Ontiru, that's O-N-T-E-E-R-U. I'd like to thank Mr. O'Leary for presiding last session. A lot of my procedures have already been established by him. but a few differences I'd like to go over briefly before our official 3 p.m. start time. First, I realize that sometimes looking at like white cards with text of numbers can be difficult, so I've color-coded my timing signals. At 2 minutes completed, you'll get the green card that says 2 minutes completed. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, you'll get the yellow. At 2 minutes and 55 seconds, you'll get the red, and below it says please conclude. At 3 minutes, I will count you down from 10 seconds. So 301, 302, 303. When you hit 310, per TOC procedure, I will issue a verbal stop because you cannot go past that time point per TOC procedure. Continuing on, my procedures for direct questioning are also a little bit different. I'm going to give you a notification at 10 seconds remaining. So after 20 seconds in your questioning block, you'll get the 10 second. Then at 5 seconds remaining, I'm going to count you down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At that point, I will cut you off at what you're saying and move to the next questioner. In addition to that, to save time when it comes to questioning, I'm going to recognize the first questioner over a video. And then for the following 3 or 1 questioners, depending on the speech given, I'm going to text in the chat. As such, if you want to ask a question, please keep your placard upright until I recognize either 4 or 2 questioners. Finally, for motions and voting on bills, I'm going to do the same thing as Senator O'Leary, which is just holding up your placard. But if you have a point of personal privilege, a point of information, or a point of order, please put it in the chat so I can recognize you much more quickly and we don't have to impede debate. Are there any questions on my procedure? Seeing none, is there a motion? Senator Bogan.
I move to open the floor for docket nominations.
Is there a second? Raise your placard. Assuming unanimous consent, so ordered. Is there a motion? Is there a docket nomination? Senator Yee.
I move to nominate docket A, starting with SF2B, followed by SF2A, followed by SF2C.
That's an order. Are there any other motion? Are there any other docket nominations? Senator Brombot.
Motion to close the floor for docket nominations.
Is there a second? All in favor? Any
Aye.
opposed? Assuming unanimous consent, so ordered, this will now be our docket. As such, we are now in line to debate Bill SF2B. Bill SF2B is a bill on the regulation upholding protection across U.S. Libraries Act. Is there an authorship? A sponsorship? Senator Lin.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber, once again, my name is Senator Lin, L-I-N. I'm giving the authorship on SF2B. Sorry, just 1 second, please. All right, same drill, nod or smile.
As a note for the chamber, I'm always ready. You don't need my nod or smile.
Is anyone not ready? Great. Remember how your parents used to tell you that social media would destroy your social life? Well, now in quarantine, social media is your social life. Everyone is turning to the internet for their work and leisure. Even my debate coach is starting to play Minecraft. In many rural areas, libraries and their information systems are the major sources of information for the youth. So let's make sure that libraries are as accurate and informed as we can make them. So the first reason why I stand on the affirmation is because we need to provide access to information for youth that need it. That's because many libraries hold regressive attitude towards sexuality or family planning, which ravages teenagers' mental health. According to Jennifer Yarger et al. In 2017, the birth rate in rural areas is much higher than in urban areas due to less access to family planning. This stems from opposition to sexual and family planning education from churches and school districts. But on the other hand, according to Mitchell Kuga in 2018, other libraries are used as community centers, often for the LGBT+ community to support each other. Books and events are a network of inclusion. Districts all around the country are ending LGBT+ community events, citing community backlash. These rural libraries are often one of the limited mechanisms through which rural youth are exposed to differing points of view. Now, many of us debated the social media bill, where we agreed that teenagers should be offered a certain level of freedom from parents to explore. This bill guarantees them freedom to access information that will support them and their mental health. But the second reason why I stand on the affirmation is because this bill simply results in better social discourse. With citizens in Michigan protesting under the sanction of the president, and with people burning 5G towers in UK, we need a dose of sanity. And according to Ryan Holmes in 2018, In a world where a majority of US adults now get their news in real time from social media feeds, one of the most important parts of our job is to make sure that we can provide proper access to information. And there's someone who is in charge of doing that. There's someone whose job is in charge of providing access to information, and that's a librarian. An increasingly important part of their job is teaching information literacy. In other words, their job is now to teach fake versus real news. Furthermore, according to Deborah Follows last month, some libraries are already 3D printing PPE and others are providing COVID-19 info resources. This should be more widespread. This should be what we should be focused on in this Congress. Not only the best equipped urban libraries should have access to these intentions and these programs, but also rural libraries. We need to make sure that rural libraries also have the same goals. Therefore, the goal of this bill is to make a more informed citizenry. This bill is just the first step. It deals with gender issues, which are very important. But this first step provides room for a better America, a better citizenry, and a better nation. Social distancing should never be a block for distant socializing. Everyone should get equal access to information. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lin, for that speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. We'll now enter 2 minutes of mandatory questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Polczyk.
Thank you. Great speech, Senator. So my
Thank you.
question to you is, who funds libraries for the most part?
You tell me.
It's states, actually. So
Okay.
what happens when states don't want their libraries, specifically conservative states, putting these things in play?
Okay, I have a few responses to that. First, defunding libraries completely is a really extreme action I don't think the states would even be willing to take. But second, we can also condition federal aid under states not defunding libraries in a further
Senator
way.
Ma.
Hi, Senator. So oftentimes do students like who are exploring or just part of the LGBTQ plus community have supportive parents,
Yes,
but like sometimes they don't, right?
definitely, yeah.
Right.
It's a
So
spectrum.
how come this legislation implements in Section 2C, library patrons who are under or the age of 12 don't have to have like mandatory parental control over everything they do in a library? Isn't that potentially detrimental to students who are part of the LGBTQ
Senator Lahiri.
age group?
Thank you. So the original filters that were imposed were meant to limit out like child pornography and obscene content, right?
Yes. Well,
Okay,
actually, it was
so that content-
music piracy first on the internet, but I get your point.
Okay, sure. Yeah, okay, I understand that. So in a world, even when we pass, we still limit out like pornographic material and all these detrimental things, right? It's
Well,
just like
yeah,
a new
I mean,
filtering
this is the
system.
first step.
Okay, yeah. So where do libraries get access to
Senator
this new
Villiamsky.
filtering system?
Hi, Representative. So going
Hello.
off of Senator Ma's line of questioning,
Mhm.
how does Section 2C still maintain access to this content?
Excuse me, could you rephrase the question?
So Section 2C, children under the age of 12 need parental permission to access the library materials.
Mhm.
How is this still maintaining access to materials for these
Two
children?
responses. First, it's still a net good, and second, this is a first step.
How is that a first step if
Thank you,
children
Senator
aren't-
Lin. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was the speech in authorship. We're now in line for the first speech in negation. Negative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Mazumdar.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. That's Mr. Mazumdar speaking for the first time this session.
Could you spell that for me?
Yeah, that's Mazumdar.
Can we make that a standing rule? Because I know your placards can be brought up, but it's hard to hold them up, and some of your names won't appear entirely on the screen for me. So let's just keep it as if we were in the room to just spell it.
Got it.
Thanks,
Ready?
everybody.
Everyone good? Okay. Libraries are a century-old source of knowledge, and as time has passed, some libraries have decided to modernize. In Texas, a library added bike desks to incentivize more young people to come and read. But today, the affirmation is pedaling off to a future, one which is dangerous for our libraries and our most vulnerable constituents. The wheels of change keep turning, but this bill doesn't go far enough. It's time to read between the lines and fail today's legislation. Now, the key realization is that this entire round needs to be viewed through the scope of the current COVID-19 pandemic. When you understand that, you see that we have to fail today's legislation because it hurts small libraries. That's because we're implementing this bill in the middle of a recession. But the problem is library revenue is on the decline. The Institute of Museum and Library Services explains in their analysis what happened to libraries in 2009 after the previous Great Recession. In times of crisis, especially in economic recession, libraries' number one priority is to maintain their organization. Their funds go to several key things. First, making sure employees are paid. Second, to rebuild their broken infrastructure. And third, maintain their library technology. The cost of all of these increased during a pandemic because people simply aren't coming to work anymore. But this legislation earmarks 7% of their funds to programming. 7%, which they can't touch. 7%, which if they do touch, they are at risk of losing federal funding, regardless of whether they're in an emergency. Now, 7% of your funds might not seem like a big problem for the New York Public Library, but for smaller libraries, which are floundering under the current pandemic, whose communities cannot allocate such an abundance of money to their maintenance, this 7% could cost them their survival. Now, that's bad for two key reasons. First, in times of hardship, libraries are just what smaller communities need. According to an article published in the Planning Commissioner's Journal in September of 2009, libraries played a large role in rebuilding local economies during a recession. They were instrumental in attracting business and creating jobs and opportunity. But when you pass it as legislation, that goes away. Not only do libraries risk closure, but their communities risk losing the centers of economic development during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Lin, you tell us that you want to protect your small libraries and that we should equalize access to information, but these small libraries are disproportionately harmed by the paywall which your legislation institutes. But if that's not enough, this legislation also restricts the access of programs and resources to kids under the age of 12. Look to the Institute of Museum and Library Services on December 13th, 2016. They tell you that community organizations, specifically libraries, are key players in providing high quality early childhood programs to help young children form a community online and have developed relationships and shared interests. But Section 2C makes it so that kids are now required to get parental consent. You can make a library extremely progressive, but if their parents still hold isolationist and disapproving values, then we open it up for unbridled influence. Stop changing your promises to your most vulnerable constituents. Start promising them change. Fail today's legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Mazumdar, for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. That was the first negative. We're now in line for 2 minutes of questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Wadawa.
Hi, Senator. So in the status quo, are libraries open?
No.
Yeah, so if they're closed right now, they don't actually have to worry about spending any of their money because they're not running, right?
The fact that they have no consumer dollars, the fact that the investments are gone because
Yeah, but they don't
closed
actually have to enact anything yet because no one's coming to the library.
Right,
They're gonna
they've
do that
lost
after they
business
open.
and federal funds, supply chains have been cut, which means they need to invest in.
Do they not have any state funding?
Senator O'Leary.
Hi, so 7% of the funding is, it's under 7% of funding for restricted resources, right? Is that what's being determined under this legislation? Okay, so how substantial is that for small libraries to the point where we can't look to the impacts after the recession?
Okay, so for small libraries, they're hit harder by the COVID-19 pandemic, which means they have to spend more money in making sure that they maintain their infrastructure. So that 7% is even worse for the smaller libraries. You make them choose between payment.
Asking these libraries to create programs immediately, or does this legislation just give them the ability to do so within any time with the rest of the year?
What the legislation does, which is most damning, is earmark 7% of funding, which they cannot touch no matter what. That's why you have to fail.
But the thing is, they're being given this funding by their states, by the federal government. What's the issue with that?
The issue is that they can't touch it for anything else except for doing these programs.
But that means they'll still allocate other funds towards paying their workers the same amount that they have right now.
Thank you. So let's talk about the parental consent point. So exactly what activities would be blocked from minors under 12?
Well, if the library has any programming which parents don't like, for example, LGBTQ programming.
Any programming, even books, children under 12 cannot read books that don't accord with their points of view?
That is also a possibility, but also like things like LGBTQ reading material could be blocked by parents, which is exactly
what the bill's trying to say. Or is that just literature?
That's programming.
Thank you, Mr. Mazumdar. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Brahmbhatt.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. That's Senator Brahmbhatt, spelled B-R-A-H-M-B-H-A-T-T. Any indication when you're ready? Before the modern era, people used to put ink to paper to document important milestones in history. Soon, as the number of documentarians rose, the first libraries were born. And since then, they have given the public an opportunity to learn about things that matter to them. We further add to that narrative today, which is why you must pass. First, when you pass, you reduce stigmatization. Right now, many students who are not currently exploring their sexual identity are sometimes ignorant towards what the term entails, which could lead to discrimination against their peers who may still be unsure or are still exploring. According to the Human Rights Council in April of 2019, less than 2% of educational institutions were able to create programs and resources guided towards gender, sexuality, or gender identity. However, with this bill, we increase inclusivity and allow students who may be discriminated against an opportunity to feel comfortable in their school environments, allowing them to be more successful in their academic rigor. The National Academy of Law in May of 2018 states that 20% of individuals will use these public programs, and specifically they'll use them in their school libraries, which is essential to reduce the stigma that is currently on the topic. We can finally provide guidance and mandates for programs that are denied or deemed unimportant right now. So now, after years of discrimination, this option gives thousands of Americans an opportunity to be cognizant and grow in their future. Second, I'd like to argue perhaps the most important clauses in this legislation is about family planning. According to the American Pregnancy Association, around 500,000 teens have become pregnant each year. The Department of Health and Human Services in 2010 furthers that the primary reasons girls are leaved or kicked out of their homes is because of their family's unwanted pregnancies. This is especially pertinent among many religious conservatives, largely in the south of the country, at the top of the list being Mississippi. The problem now becomes that a major mental strain is put on these teenagers as they now have to make a life-altering decision for themselves at the age of 15 to 19. And almost any agency that could help them with their decision face-to-face is either difficult to find or difficult to access, as majority are headquartered in densely populated areas such as New York or Los Angeles. This is why these family programs at the library are extremely important for these girls, as many of these nonprofits that specialize in the area can easily set up programs or seminars to assist them with family planning and their pregnancy. We have to make a difficult process easier for our people, and we can only do that once we pass. Senators, out of awareness comes policy. Let's ensure that we are giving people the information that they need, and libraries can do that for them. Pass.
Thank you, Senator Brombot, for that speech of 2 minutes and 49 seconds. We'll now enter 1 minute of mandatory questioning. If you wish to question, please raise your placards. Senator Burkhart.
Thank you. Okay, so for non-compliance, what are we doing basically under today's piece of legislation?
We can't frame this legislation under possible non-compliance by
Well,
law.
when they don't comply with it, we cut off the federal funding, right?
Right, but that would be an
How much?
incentive for them,
What's
to
the
comply
what's
with
the percentage of library revenue that's created from federal funding? Is it a large amount?
It's not about that. It's more about this would be an incentive for them to create these programs in the first place.
Well, if it's a small percentage, don't you think they'd probably weigh the concerns of their citizens over the small percentage of federal?
Hi, Representative Brombat. So you would probably agree with me that a lot of municipalities aren't really in favor of expanding these programs, right?
Correct, but
So
we
there are a lot of state and local laws that conflict with this piece of legislation. What are libraries going to do?
there are no laws that conflict with any of this, encouraging
There
these
are no
programs that vendors-
state laws that would possibly restrict this content?
No, because there are no laws that restrict family planning or anything of the such, or else nonprofits would also
Thank
be
you, Senator Brombot. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Jawar.
Thank you. For the judge's reference, that's Jawar. It's spelled J-H-A-W-A-R. If I could just get a smaller nod from y'all. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Let me grab my timer. In my favorite children's movie, Matilda Wormwood finds a home outside her home in books, where she escapes the controlling beliefs of her family and can grow her mind. In a particularly moving scene, her father refuses to buy her a book because he disagrees with its premise, a scene that reflected reality for thousands of American children. Libraries are an opportunity for escape. Don't lock them with this legislation. The primary reason you fail this bill is that libraries are a key resource for children to learn outside their homes. Catherine Zucker from the Pew Research Center finds on May 1st of 2013 that 81% of individuals surveyed testify that a major reason libraries are important is that they provide information and resources unavailable at home. This is information that parents refuse to let their children search up on the internet or normally read about due to ideological disagreements and bans on information. But what happens when you pass this legislation? Section 2C mandates that for any individual under 12 years old, parents must authorize every program they attend and every book they check out. Senator Brombach and Senator Lynn, that means all LGBTQ plus programming and books runs through parents first, and there is no guarantee they'll let them check it out in the first place. This Congress, in an attempt to increase access to information, will only promote indoctrination. What are the effects of this crackdown? First off, it harms the development of identity. A June 13th, 2017 report by Anna Brown from the Pew Research Center finds that over 60% of LGBTQ plus individuals report feeling signs of their identity below the age of 12. A library provides access to books, online resources, and even in-person programs to help these children. But this legislation kills their opportunity to access them. A December 1st, 2017 report published by Sabra L. Wise from Harvard Medical School finds that 1 out of every 3 LGBTQ plus individuals report being rejected from their family after they disclose their identity. And another 1 out of 3 report hiding their identity due to concerns about how their family would receive it. Senator Lynn, both you and I are on the same page and wanting to help LGBTQ plus children, but I don't think the best way to help them is revealing their identity to their parents based upon them wanting to learn more about what they're going through. Senator Lynn, that also means they never get to access this content in the first place. But even more so than that, the School Library Journal's 2016 controversial book survey found that more than 90% of school librarians report recently not buying a book that they otherwise would have because of the controversy associated with it. That only increases when you pass this legislation because librarians are worried about what parents will let their children read. That means you limit access to information overall. Don't turn the walls of libraries into cages of orthodoxy.
Thank you, Senator Jawar. For the purpose of the judge, at the time that speech was 3 minutes and 9 seconds. We will now enter 1 minute of questioning. Those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Brombach.
So doesn't this legislation give leeway for a parent to possibly give a permission slip a month in advance and have their child attend the library for a whole month before they have to renew it?
No, the legislation specifically stipulates that the parent has to look at every single thing they check out and every program they go to.
Correct. So can this be something that is done way before the time of the actual checkout? Do they have to be there?
I mean, the parent has to know. That's the problem. You are exposing the child's identity.
So, okay, so how
Senator
are
Yee.
children under the age of 12?
What happens to these queer individuals once they reach the age of 13? Are they able to freely go to libraries and discover these programs themselves?
Yes, but 60% of them feel it under the age of 12. I believe they have an opportunity to read about it and learn about what they're going
But there's no net harm because in the status quo, if their parents are suppressing them, they're not even going to go to the library in the first place.
Yes, they probably would. In the status quo, they can go to the library and learn about it without.
Right, and if the child knows that their parents disagree, they're not going to go and out themselves.
Time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. Thousands of the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Bogan.
I thank the chair. For the judges, that's Jonathan Bogan, spelled B-O-G-E-N, speaking for the first time this session on the affirmation of this legislation. I'm now at the leisure of my judges, presiding officer, whenever you guys are ready. Well, I know PO is always ready, but judges. Good, good, and good. All right. Being in the library was always a hassle. Whenever I wanted to ask one of my friends a question or simply say hello quietly, the librarian always took it upon herself to violently shush me. In the beginning, it was no food, no drinks, and no phones. But now it seems that diversity is about to join the list. Let's make some noise for those who are silently screaming across our country. So let's see how this legislation ensures that reading is fun again. Pass this bill to enhance library education by making library services both more widely available and inclusive. Margot Gustina of the Library Journal writes on June 8th of 2017 that inclusive libraries seek to eradicate systemic barriers by empowering the voices of the less privileged. They can facilitate the distribution of greater community resources in order to further their goals. So Mr. Mazumdar tells us to view this legislation in the context of COVID-19. Let's do that. When libraries are made to service more diverse groups, they're likely to get more donations and federal funding. And that's more critical than it ever has been before. As an AP News analysis writes on February 1st of 2019, due to funding cuts, libraries have had to trim services such as reading programs for children, cut community outreach programs, and even fire some of the very few employees the library has. But Mr. Jawar says this legislation isn't effective because it allows parents to stop kids under 12 from letting their kids go to the library. But he neglects the other 6 years these children have without parental consent to learn and become adults that think for themselves before indoctrination. But it goes a lot farther than that. When you pass today's legislation and expand libraries, you ultimately reverse the online trend of education, seeing that when you pass this bill, you make learning a community effort once more. That's important because it increases tolerance and intelligence alike. But now let's see how this bill makes talking tolerable again. Pass this bill to encourage tasteful discourse by encouraging libraries to seek out appropriate alternatives for social literature. Tracy DeLassio of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute finds that librarians should learn about the book in question and determine if it has redeeming educational value, rather than just sex or violence. This allows librarians to seek an appropriate alternative to convey the same theme. So, Mr. Majumdar, I agree that parents will want to keep some things out of their kids' hand, but that's not mutually exclusive from this legislation. In fact, that's why you passed the bill. This legislation forces librarians' hand, and when they have to meet a standard of decency, libraries become the best sources of social messages. James B. Ayers of Savannah State University finds that increased use of the internet has caused a significant degradation of decency within online interactions. Due to anonymity, users are less hesitant to use excessive means in order to spread ideas. So, Mr. Mazumdar, small libraries won't just collapse because that 7% doesn't actually need to be paid for. There are many inclusive events that libraries can host, but are rejecting in the status quo because we haven't passed this bill. For once, you can have inclusivity free of charge. When you pass this bill and bring people back to the books, we teach people in ways that don't demonize the opposition or radicalize personalities. That's so integral. Let's not let the stories of our people be shushed for good.
Thank you, Mr. Bogan, for that speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. We will now enter 1 minute of questioning. Those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Mr. Mazumdar.
Hi, Senator.
Hi. So what are the most formative years of a child's life?
I mean, I would say that it's like their early childhood, like very early.
Scientists consider it everything from years 1 to 12, which is specifically under this legislation. So how is it not a problem?
Because when they're that young, they don't really understand those types of issues, and it's not necessary that they don't need parental consent.
In that age, 25% of students already develop their sexuality. So
I understand that, but when they can go to libraries after 12, that's much more important. You can expand and get rid of
parents control everything.
Senator Jawar.
Hi, Senator. In the status quo, if someone is under the age of 12 and checks out a book about LGBTQ plus identity, do their parents have to know?
Yeah, but that's not important.
No, they don't. In the status quo, you don't have to tell your parents.
Some libraries they do.
Legislation, you do.
No,
Does that not out there?
In my local library, you have to, in fact. So it's state, like kind of.
Okay, but not in all federal libraries. This makes that a federal policy.
Okay,
Is that not a net harm?
No, it's not, because the 6 years later, they can get what they need.
The time for questioning is elapsed, Senator Bogan. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. Once again, for all speakers, if you want to ask a question, please make sure that your placard is high into the camera so I make sure that I can recognize you correctly. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a negative speech. Negative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Lahiri.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber, that's Senator Lahiri, spelled L-A-H-I-R-I, speaking on the negative of this piece of legislation. Just a smile or nod when you're ready. Our world's greatest leaders, Lincoln, Washington, MLK, often develop their most insightful ideas while sitting in libraries. Yet, the second we constrict the dissemination of these very materials is the second we close the door on the Lincolns, Washingtons, and MLKs of tomorrow. Unfortunately, it is passing that destroys our library's ability to act as the nexus for knowledge, which is why I am proud to negate. Allow me to offer a framework for this round. Regardless of whether we pass or not, we still need to regulate these systems to a certain degree, which is what Mr. Lin told me in questioning. This means that in maintaining some sort of filtering system, this policy writes its own circumvention mechanism. The issue in the status quo is that there's no transparency as to what is being censored. That means that passing does absolutely nothing to ameliorate this concern. It sets up a situation where either A, libraries get new filters, or B, libraries institute their own. Let's examine scenario 1 where libraries get new filters. UC Berkeley School of Law explains in 2011 that Google recently won a settlement to expand their digital library set, which sets a precedent for not only their expansion into the future, as well as that of other tech companies like Amazon, which are trying to overrun the digital book industry. The article concludes that when regulatory policies continue to be imposed upon libraries, such as that stipulated in this legislation, that only makes entire digital transition more likely. Right now, federally owned libraries are increasingly privatized, specifically by big tech companies like Google. Unfortunately, altering the information filtering method when we pass is one where private firms are now in charge. This means two things. First, Wired explains in 2009 that enforcement of this legislation is impossible because there's no carrot for funding to dangle before these companies, which allows them to charge libraries super high prices for institutional subscriptions to their databases. The second implication is censorship, which gets even worse when privatized companies are at the helm, because Wired furthers that they have the right to keep, quote, 15% of their content out of available databases altogether, which would detriment our entire state. This argument obliterates the former regurgitative schema of the round. Mr. Brombot and Mr. Javar, public libraries may isolate some regional rural communities and certain families, but if we pass, the region isolated will be the entire United States of America. But now let's look to scenario 2 where libraries institute their own filtering systems. The issue here is not about consent or about COVID bankrupting libraries. The Center for American Progress notes in 2016 that when libraries have to create their own internal systems to filter data, it would cost them about $2 million in taxpayer money. This is exactly why the American Libraries Institute explains in 2019 that instead of having to deal with harsher regulations, libraries get rid of online databases altogether because 38% of their concerns were raised about online material. Public Knowledge explains in 2019 that over 31% of Americans in rural communities rely on libraries for any access to innovation. Millions of hardworking Americans aren't able to participate in and grow in the digital economy. Don't further disenfranchise them.
Lahiri, for that piece of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We will now move into 1 minute of questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Bogan.
Hi, Senator.
Hi.
So kids are most vulnerable to like a lack of filters, right?
Okay.
Okay, parents can check out any activity the kid is doing in a library, right?
Sure.
So what's the net harm if the parent can still monitor them?
Wait, the argument is that in the status, like in a system where all of the data is privatized, i.e. Google regulates, they have the ability to limit out 15% of content. That's not necessarily, I guess, about LGBTQ individuals.
Why would they have to change if parents just can monitor their kids and see what
but it's not just about monitoring, it's about altering filtering systems.
Great speech, Senator. So my question to you is which organization provides more information accessed by the general public, Google or libraries?
So the UC Berkeley evidence that I read you explains that right now Google is in a position to take over the market, and when we over-regulate libraries, then they put them in a better position.
Google
Sorry,
is
what?
People. Google is accessed by more people.
Sure.
Right? Okay, and libraries are regulated. So doesn't it stand to reason that
but Google can limit out 15% of digital media content.
Elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech in negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Wadawa.
I thank the chair for the judges and chambers reference. That's Senator Wadwa, spelled W-A-D-H-W-A. Just a thumbs up when you're ready, please. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Some of us will go our whole lives without realizing the value of a library, the value of a safe space, a bubble shielding us from the politicized realities of this country, a place to just learn, a place to just be. In my communities, the libraries serve us. and they do all across the country. And that's why I believe that we should affirm today's piece of legislation. Senator Lynn and Senator Brombaugh touch upon the idea of increased access to sexual education, and that's important, but allow me to expand it even further, because today's legislation bridges the gap between rural and urban healthcare. And this is true because increasing access to inclusive and culturally diverse health resources in libraries helps communities with little internet access. In the status quo, only 22 states require that sex and/or HIV education must be medically, factually, or technically accurate. Additionally, state definitions of medically accurate vary, from requiring that the Department of Health review curriculum for accuracy to mandating that the curriculum be based on any published information. Senators, it's not acceptable that only 22 states mandate this type of education. But when we pass today, we give students access to sexual education materials, and the impacts of that are endless. The American Academy of Pediatrics states that libraries are increasingly used as a space to provide targeted public health promotion and even healthcare, often through partnerships through public libraries, universities, community organizations, and local governments. This prevents or reduces the risk of adolescent pregnancy, HIV, and STIs for children and adolescents alike. Now, Senator Lahiri brings up a good point, that often a lot of resources are accessed through companies like Google and Amazon. But Senator, what you fail to realize is that in many rural communities, there is very little to no internet access. So where do they turn? To the libraries. We need to understand that today's legislation doesn't pose any inherent harm. It can only do benefit. But second, let's look at why this legislation uniquely addresses the issue. And that's because of solvency. Section 3 states that the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services enforces this legislation by withholding federal funding from any state and/or municipal library services enacting restrictions or censorship. This is important because Senator Pelsick brought up in cross-examination that states tend to fund these state libraries, but that's not entirely true. Because this California Legislative Analyst's Office states that 39% of the state general fund for libraries comes from federal funding. So they do receive state funding, but it's not entirely funded by the states. When senators on the negation come up here and claim that this legislation won't actually be effective, that's not accurate, because today's legislation is the most effective way of ensuring that libraries actually follow our regulations. At the end of the day, senators, stand for keeping these safe spaces safe. Affirm.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Waterwood, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds exactly. We're now in line for 1 minute of questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Between those, it goes to Senator Lahiri on recency.
Thank you. Great speech, Representative. So where do poor rural communities and rural libraries get $2 million to fund new filtering systems?
So they don't get that money, but the libraries do have enough money to make sure
they
can
have $2
allocate more
million?
than 7%. They only need to allocate more than 7% towards these materials.
Wait. But if there's a new filtering system that needs to be instituted, how can they only allocate 7% of their budget to it?
They don't need to redo their entire filtering system. They just need to make sure that there's enough so that more than 7%
Senator
of their
Rodriguez
funding goes towards these resources.
Hi, so who provides more funding like to the average library, states or the federal government?
States.
Right, so if this legislation only withholds federal funding, which doesn't make up the majority of funding, why would libraries comply?
Federal funding is 39% of the funding, and although that's not a majority, it's still a really big part because in the status quo, libraries don't have a whole lot of funding.
But
so
if some
take away that
libraries,
federal funding, it's effective.
If some libraries morally object to this legislation,
Thank you,
why
Senator
is this
Waterwood. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your speech. That was a speech in the affirmative. We're now in line for a speech in negative. Please raise your placards if you'd like to give it. Senator Pelsick.
I thank the chair. Once again, for my judges, that's Senator Pelsick, spelled P-A-L-T-Z-I-K. If I could get any indication from my judges when they're ready. I see 1, 2, 3. Great. Albert Einstein once said that the only thing you absolutely have to know is the location of a library. I know this because he said it to me the same year I got elected to the 81st Congress. But I also know that I'm pretty old, and times have changed. The way we receive information is now fundamentally different. To truly protect libraries, let's fail this bill. Now, first, the entire affirmatives advocacy is contingent upon the assumption that libraries will stay open. However, Section 3 of this bill states that the enforcement of this legislation is withholding federal funding from any state or municipal library system that enacts restrictions or censorship. There is a significant problem with this because it assumes that states will give up attempts at information restriction under the threat of losing library funding. But states are more than willing to sacrifice their libraries. Kansas proves. According to Crystal Thomas of the Kansas City Star in January, public libraries that display age-inappropriate material could lose state funding and even see their librarians jailed under a Missouri bill drafted in reaction to drag queen story hours. This is not an isolated event. I asked Senator Lynn in questioning what happens to state-funded libraries, and he said that complete defunding is unlikely. He is wrong. According to a Minnesota bill, a public library that hosts a drag queen story hour shall have regional library system support reduced by 100%. 21 state governments are completely controlled by Republicans that are likely to follow this precedent. When we make the same threats as state governments, we put librarians in a double bind. They either host an event and lose all state funding and risk prison, or cancel an event and lose all federal funding. We are trying to protect libraries by threatening their very existence. How, Senator Lynn and Senator Bogan? I have one question for you. Does a closed library provide any benefit to the community? There is no access to any programming if a library is closed. But second, let's talk about libraries in the other 39 states. Senator Brombach and Senator Wadwa are very optimistic about all the benefits this bill will provide, but it's just not feasible. By forcing libraries to either restrict or censor programs, we force them to deal with the massive costs. California proves in an October Freedom of Information request that found that the town of Chula Vista, California paid over $42,000 in police protection in order to have a drag queen story hour due to its extreme unpopularity with citizens. To make matters worse, the burden falls solely on local communities. Leda Nack, the director of the First Amendment Center at the Freedom Forum Institute, explains that a 1992 Supreme Court ruling set a precedent that the entire burden falls on libraries already struggling to stay open. Senator Brombach, while every contribution to the public sphere of diversity of thought is intrinsically valuable, so are the limited resources that small communities have. We mustn't let our enlightened mentality overtake our fiscal reality. We must fail today's bill.
Thank you, Senator Polczyk, for that speech of 2 minutes and 55 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of questioning. Those wishing to question, please raise your placards. On recency, that's going to go to Senator Wadwa.
Thank you. Hi, Senator. So does federal law trump state law?
In some cases it does not.
So legally it does. So if we say that censorship is illegal under today's legislation, will states actually be able to consider censorship legal?
Yes, there are cases where the federal government cannot override. That's called a federal overreach of power.
I understand, but this doesn't constitute federal overreach of power.
These are state libraries, meaning that states can do what they want with them.
I understand, but the federal government still has the
So
power.
under this legislation, that libraries only lose funding if they impose restrictions, right? Yeah. So why would libraries continue to impose restrictions if they know that they're going to lose funding? I don't understand the mentality behind that.
Let me explain. Okay, so the majority of libraries are mostly funded by states. Many states don't want these things to be happening in libraries. So they say that the libraries must restrict them. Okay. If we don't let the states restrict them, then the states are going to pull out funding.
But this is a federal law.
Okay. For questions elapsed.
Thank you.
Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmative speakers rise. Senator O'Leary.
I thank the chair. Hello, everybody. I am Representative O'Leary. That is O'Leary spelled O-L-E-A-R-Y. I'm speaking on the affirmation of this legislation, and whenever my judges are ready, just give me a thumbs up, nod, smile, whenever you're ready. PO always ready? Okay. When I was in 4th grade, I remember being the top reader at my public library. In fact, with over 300 points on my reading counts quizzes, sometimes I could barely contain my excitement. So Mr. Bogan, I too know what it's like to have to stay quiet in the library. But as I grew up, I learned that my having to be quiet in the library was the least of my concerns, because around the nation that I would soon represent individual expression will continue to be silenced by the libraries without ever given the opportunity to speak at all. I want to change that and make sure that even though libraries must stay quiet, everybody has an opportunity to speak. So first, let's turn our pages to chapter 1, where we'll learn a first lesson about equality. We decrease media discrimination under this legislation, and that's because it stops the restriction on culturally diverse books through library censorship. The School and Public Library Journal explains in September of 2016 that titles by and about people of color or individual expression constituted only 25% of the 3,400 books received by centers. Challengers of banned media often targeted diverse books in public institutions, but the Catalog for School Information Service furthers in 2016 that the inclusion of multicultural literature in library collections confirmed that the beliefs and experiences of minority students are valued. Here's why that's important under this legislation. When you get rid of restrictions that libraries impose, that means that more diverse forms of media, whether that be through culture or gender identity, are allowed into libraries. So Mr. Jawar and Mr. Mazumdar both premise their entire argument under Section 2C of this legislation, but those arguments are built on two assumptions. Number one, every person who checks out LGBTQ+ or other culturally diverse media is under the age of 12, which is already flawed because neither of them proved that these people actually check out the media. But second, they also failed to prove that every library provides access to this media in the status quo. I've already proven that most of them don't because of restrictions. So here's what we need to realize. There's an incredibly important impact to getting rid of restrictions, and that's because restrictions increase cultural and diversity marginalization. That's because the result of less diverse and individually expressive books in schools and libraries means that students get less exposure to other cultures. The Atlantic explains in October of 2016 that keeping books about certain types of children or experiences out of libraries or putting them on separate shelves perpetuates a troubling vision of a sheltered American childhood that decreases tolerance to other cultures and identities. So Mr. Jawar and Mr. Mazumdar, allowing for more media that helps promote individuality and expression means that tolerance is built up for younger generations for every single form of individual expression. This legislation increases tolerance in the long term. We're not a library, so it's time that you make sure you speak for equality.
Thank you, Senator O'Leary, for that speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Khan.
Hi, Senator. So under the status quo, do these libraries receive state or federal funding?
I think it depends on the library, but you tell me.
Poltech to talk about state funding, right?
Okay, state funding.
How does this bill have any enforcement mechanism under that?
So the enforcement mechanism is that we revoke funding from libraries that don't get rid of their restrictions.
But if they have state funding, then this Congress doesn't have any oversight on revoking.
The federal government, when we impose a piece of legislation that will override the state law.
But you just said it's
Mazumdar on recency.
So what percent of Americans are against gay marriage?
You tell me.
So it's near 40%, right?
Okay.
So if those are parents, and a lot of them are, what is stopping them from restricting their children's access to LGBTQ material in their formative years?
Right, so I completely understand that. What you need to realize is that just because these parents are against that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to find out about every single piece of media, because if they check it out over the age of 13, it won't make a difference.
The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat.
Thank you.
That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Velyunsky.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Velyunsky speaking for the first time this session. That's spelled VELYUNSKIY. I can't see the judges from my Zoom, so if the PO could let me know when the judges are ready, please.
Or is any judge not ready? All judges are ready.
Great, thank you. Legacy. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. That's a line from the musical Hamilton, and every day it reminds me of the legacy we're leaving for our constituents. So today, we negate, because this bill fails, our legacy to our children. Now, firstly, this bill ties the idea of censorship to socioeconomic status. Currently, especially in underserved regions, libraries have such limited resources that they begin to restrict who gets access to them as a punishment for those who can't afford to pay back their fees. According to the New York Times in September of 2018, libraries are already starved for resources. In some cities, entire branches are being shut down. The public library budget is so tight that users with overdue fees above $20 aren't allowed to borrow books or use computers. So Senators Lynn and Wadhwa, when you say that this bill increases access to children in rural communities, understand that those are exactly the libraries that are struggling the most financially. Even if we're accomplishing the goal of removing censorship and providing access, this access is only available to those who can afford it. And especially because low-income students are less likely to have internet access at home and rely on the free internet at the library. If we affirm, we create a division of who receives information. Only those who can afford to pay back overdue fees can afford to have access to truly free libraries. Now, secondly, let's understand how local communities make this bill impossible to be passed. Right now, events like drag queen story hours have grown in popularity, but they've been met with controversy, especially in the South. According to the Washington Post in November of 2019, books involving LGBTQ issues have captured the most attention and have prompted a heated debate in the district. Angry parents have spoken out at board meetings and circled petitions, demanding that the explicit books be removed. Parents don't want these events in their communities, so they won't attend, and they'll force their children to not attend either. So in questioning, Representative Politic was asked if federal law regarding censorship trumped state law, and that's a good question. So let me clear it up. Federal law does trump state law, but it's not about the law. It's about the community's response to these programs. Libraries are losing patrons due to these programs. So while Senator Brombaugh touts the amount of individuals who use all public programs as a reason to affirm this bill, the amount of individuals who use the programs outlined in the bill is significantly less because parents prevent their children from going. Senator Bogan, how are libraries supposed to get more donations when the community is threatening to boycott the library over these programs? And under this bill, these programs cannot be removed in order to gain back the support of the community, since the bill strips already resource-strapped libraries of federal funding if they try to cut these events. Libraries are trapped in a vicious cycle they can't get out of. Today, we negate to finally repair our legacies in public libraries.
Thank you, Senator Walensky, for that speech of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. We're now in line for a minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Now, Senator Josephson.
Hey, Senator, so you're saying that overdue fees are keeping our poorest constituents from getting the books they need, right?
Right. If you live in an area that has underfunded libraries, if you have overdue fees, you can't access materials.
Okay, can you incur overdue fees by reading things on the internet?
No, you can't, but
okay, can you incur overdue fees by going to a library event?
If you already have overdue fees, you can't use the internet. That's the point.
Can you incur them?
What if you check out books and use the internet?
No, but you're
you
not
can
answering
still
my
incur
question.
them.
You're not answering my question. Can
You don't have access to all the resources.
Thank you. So can we agree on one thing, that LGBT plus youth should have access to more information?
Absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think it's fair to say that since the community resists it, we won't take action on it? Are we going to bow down?
I'm saying that we're putting libraries in a horrible position of either removing the programs to comply with the community or losing federal funding.
So
Either way, libraries have no option. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Thank you, Senator Walensky. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. Bows of speech in the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Yee.
I thank the chair. That is Representative Y.E. As always, at the leisure of my judges and my parley. Great. Back in middle school, my science class was watching a documentary on Netflix. We saw all the genres of TV shows and movies, and one student even said, "I wish there was a Netflix for books." My teacher just laughed and said, "You mean a library?" Libraries were created in our country before we ratified the Constitution. They've been there as a pillar of objective information. And today, because we must realize that libraries can play an even bigger role in the education of the future of our country, children, we pass. First, You passed today's legislation not only to create an avenue for information on sexuality and gender, but also for comprehensive sexual education. In the status quo, school districts across the nation lack comprehensive sex ed, but realize that when we pass, we change that when we use libraries. I'll explain why this is feasible. A report by the American Civil Liberties Union tells us in 2017 that proponents of abstinence-only curriculum forced hundreds of school districts away from comprehensive sex ed that has been proved to lower rates of sexual assault and rape. Representative Mazumdar talks about funding for small libraries, but realize states have to contribute 3 matching dollars for every 4 federal dollars they receive. Representative Wadwa actually misspoke. Federal funding makes up a larger amount of library funding. The combined federal and state funding can be used for, most importantly, libraries. But let's clear some other things up. Representative Polczyk is concerned about libraries closing, but that's not even going to be the majority. Let's say even if Kansas closes all of their libraries, that's 49 states where libraries fully have this information and all continue to fight for change because as the federal government, we can fund and keep those libraries alive. Students aren't given this type of information until they're 18 years old when they're in schools. So even for the 6 years between age 12 and age 18, they finally have the chance to inform themselves. You passed today's legislation to finally give extensive sexual education a chance to flourish in neighborhoods all across the country. But next, let's talk about something that has yet to be brought up at all. We passed to crack down on prison library censorship. And that's true because we address the processes of censorship that occur in prison libraries, as well as the roles of the library and the librarian within the organization of a prison. Tammy Arford of Northeastern University tells us in July of 2013 that while many librarians see the library as a rehab tool, they argue that the majority of custody staff and administrators see it as a mechanism of social control, albeit one that they are less than enthusiastic to support with resources. Christopher Zokas of Prison Legal News tells us in December of 2018 that this actually happened in Texas. Texas censored several books in their state prisons, including Women Behind Bars and How America Profits from Crime, because they contained short passages of non-explicit sexual content. Yet, they allowed other books with sexual content. Prisons use state regulations on sexual content as an excuse to ban books that could give the incarcerated important information. Prisons are supposed to be a space of rehab and education to re-enter the world.
Thank you, Senator Yee, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Between those standing, that will go to Senator Burkhart on recency.
Okay, so this protects current programs that exist for sexual education, right, in these libraries?
Correct.
What are the programs like, or how expansive is sexual education in libraries under the status quo? Do you know?
So when I used to volunteer in libraries, a lot of this planning came with talking to librarians, and then it included like publicizing information on the internet about when these sessions occur.
Okay, sure, that may have been your experience, but do you know like what a nationwide trend is when it comes to sexual education in libraries?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you know like what the nationwide trend is when it comes to sex ed in libraries?
Senator Jawar.
Is there any LGBTQ plus programming in libraries right now?
Yes.
Are there students accessing that programming?
Yes.
Is it fair that all of those students have to now run that programming by their parents?
Right. So the thing is, they don't necessarily, like, it's like the issue with that argument is that you're assuming all the students who are LGBTQ are under the age of 12. People, once they reach the age of 13, they still need this kind of information.
60% felt it under the age of 12.
Thank you,
But now we're giving it to more.
Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech in the affirmation negation speakers. Please raise your placards. Senator Ma.
I thank the chair. I'm Senator Ma, speaking for the first time this session. I'm at the leadership of all this with me, just any indication. Ma spelled M-A. Derived from American folklore, the saying, "the devil is in the details," warns us about the consequences of making decisions without considering all of the factors that play a key role. And it's when we pass legislation that overlooks and alienates those who need help the most that we become the devils in the eyes of our constituents. So the first detail has been something that's been addressed over the course of this entire debate, and yet it still has not been settled. Because although this legislation aims to open up information and exposure for the LGBT plus community, there's a significant detail that takes a huge step backwards. And that's the issue of parental consent that's been brought up by 3 separate negation speakers throughout the course of this debate. Because the bill mandates that children 12 and under must have parental consent for all library activities. But in questioning, Senator Yee originally brought up a good point. Why can't the children just wait until they're 13? And since then, Senators Bogan and O'Leary have both relied on this argument in their questioning sessions. So whether or not the affirmation ultimately wins this argument is going to determine whether every single one of their impacts about inclusivity for the LGBT plus community actually flow through. So allow me to provide 2 responses to this argument. First, understand that this legislation actually has an easy fix. We don't need to force children to wait years to access crucial information. We don't need to force them to wait until they're 13. Increasing inclusivity and allowing children under 12 to access information about sexuality are not mutually exclusive. I don't see any reason to deprive these children of critical resources. But second, also understand that children under 12 often probably don't realize the fundamental viewpoints their parents have, especially if they don't understand the ramifications. When their parents see them obliviously looking for resources about their gender identity, they essentially become outed because they don't know better. Let's remember the impacts that Senator Jawar originally brought up. Being outed or forced to conceal themselves leads to higher rates of depression and suicide among these youth. The literal lives of our children are at risk under this legislation. I can't stand for that. But the second detail that this legislation overlooks is the fact that it defines pornography and indecent speech very vaguely, because the American Library Association explains that in contrast to obscenity and child pornography, so-called indecent speech or pornography is fully protected by the First Amendment. So sexually explicit speech is often colloquially called pornography, and the word pornography has no meaning in the law, and there's no agreed upon definition for the term. So when library policies and procedures address illegal speech or sexually explicit content, they need to be employing the more precise terminology established by the Supreme Court, such as obscenity and child pornography, to describe and discuss the categories of content that may be restricted by the library. But the thing is, this legislation doesn't include those kind of specifications, meaning that one of 2 things happen. Either First Amendment protected speech is prohibited, which is obviously a violation of the Constitution, or speech that is actually not protected by the First Amendment and is dangerous to our youth is not restricted by the libraries. Either way, that's a huge issue. So because of the 2 major details that this legislation overlooks, and because of the failure of the affirmation to effectively address them, this legislation ultimately must be failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mall, for that speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of mandatory questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Between those, Senator Brombot.
Hi, Senator. Is Section 1 just about sexuality content?
It's not just, but that's been
It's also
actually,
about
that's been a contention in
status.
every single affirmation speakers.
It's also about criminal status, correct?
Yes.
Right. So why would a child under 12 have access to some content like a criminal status or criminal yeah.
For my second contention, I wasn't talking about children just under 12. I was talking about like all people accessing library material.
Right. So isn't that 12-year age limit a safety measure?
That, yeah, but for the problem is people above age 12 can still access those because there's no mandatory.
Senator Bogan.
consent. So that's still a problem for people above.
Senator
age.
Bogan.
Hi, Senator. Do you think accessible media is good?
There are pros and cons, but I think overall it's good.
All right. And you think kids should be able to access it regardless of their age?
Yes.
Then why not amend the legislation? Because it's doing everything you want except for one tiny detail.
No, I explicitly provided 2 contentions in my speech.
Yeah,
and also
that part is bad. Just get rid of that part. You like accessible media. Kids should get it. That happens.
Thank you, Senator Mall. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech to the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Khan.
Thank the chair. As always, any indication of when my judges are ready? Good. All good? Cool. On page 30 of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, you'll find one of the book's many themes spoken by Atticus Finch. You'll never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. The empathy of an American classic is the guiding factor. I ask for you to make a decision in today's legislation. Don't limit those who are already severely restricted. Support this bill. First, I think we can all agree Libraries should be more inclusive, but the question of today's debate is whether today's bill is actually the right solution. So let's first address all the negative concerns with our solution. If these concerns don't pan out, you vote in the affirmation. Start off all the way with Representative Mazumdar, who explains small libraries are hurt because their funding is spent on other places. He misunderstands the bill. The bill says 7% of what's already allocated for yearly programming or research funds. That doesn't mean 7% of overall funds. Therefore, libraries don't really waste resources on anything. Then you move on to Representative Lahiri, who says we overregulate libraries in the status quo. But if you listen closely to her speech, she has no warranting or clear reasoning as to why that could result in any harm in any situation. Then you look at Representative Polczek, who explains libraries withhold state funding if today's bill is passed. But that's when you look at this bill's null and void clause and how federal funding would be withheld. And there's no reason to believe that when you pass today's bill, state legislature wouldn't update their law as well. Then go on to Representative Leonski, that people don't have access to these resources. She elaborates that the community doesn't approve of these resources in the first place. But that is ever the more reason to affirm, to expose more people to these materials instead of rejecting them from it. Lastly, you see Senator Jawar and Ma's concern, perhaps the most pressing one. The one that says this bill doesn't promote inclusivity because parents will just restrict the content in the first place. The issue, however, is more complex because they face a catch-22 situation where children can adhere to parents' wishes or they can create a space of accessibility. As Jonathan Billington explained from the Chicago Tribune on August 24th, 2013, that the librarians have encountered objections from parents before, but if the requirement to use any library materials is to have parents sign, it becomes a standard. So parents don't necessarily need to know that their children are engaging in that specific inclusive content. There you see that these parents don't get exposed to these children's ideologies. And with that, no negative concern stands. But you can only pass if the affirmative provides a real benefit. So it goes. The impact of these restrictions are real. When libraries restrict access, they violate intellectual freedoms. Many library policies restrict a significant access to diverse resources and violate established principles of intellectual freedom. Today's debate was one that revolves around promoting equal opportunity and the accessibility of information. At the end of the debate, your vote is going to be cast for whatever side provides more information is available in their world. Pass today's legislation so that the motto of our libraries never becomes all content is equal, but some are more equal than others. Affirm.
Thank you, Senator Khan, for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. We are now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Ma.
Hi, Senator. So I'm a little confused. If the legislation explicitly requires parents to give permission for everything the children check out or what programs they participate in, how do the parents not see that?
No, it's an initiatory condition to sign something that says, yes, I approve of all these content resources in the library.
Wait, so if the student wants to participate in a program designed towards that area of education?
I'll give you a situation. If someone's parents would then receive a form when a children goes to the library, they can see a form and sign it off.
So the form doesn't say what the program is or what it's for.
Senator Volinsky.
Hi, Representative. So what happens to libraries where the community boycotts the library due to the programs that they offer?
First of all, I would say that there's no harm of trying to get them to get exposed to these resources.
What if the libraries no longer have patrons because the surrounding community doesn't support what they're doing?
No, so I would say that's ever the more reason to affirm, to finally expose people to what they don't know. They can finally get more people to be involved.
These communities have already been exposed. How have they reacted?
I really don't see a harm.
Thank you, Senator Khan. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech in the affirmation. We're now in line for a negative speech. All negative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Christian Rodriguez. Rodriguez spelled R-O-D-R-I-G-U-E-Z. Whenever you're ready. Just give me 1 second to set up the timer and then I'll get going. In our democracy, educational liberty has been valued as one of the greatest things we can provide anyone. No matter who you are, where you come from, or who you identify as, you are entitled to whatever knowledge you want. And because this legislation is a blatant misinterpretation of this and only ensures less people have this access and more people are shackled to have no educational liberty, I ask you to fail this piece of legislation. Let's divide this debate into two key issues and see why the negation wins both of them. First, on the issue of whether or not we actually increase access to content regarding family planning or gender studies or something like that, the negation wins this argument on every single front. I hate to be that guy this late into the debate to play the definition game, but we really need to do it. No one has talked about sections 2A or 2B, despite the fact that they provide blatant loopholes for any library that does not want to provide access to this content. Let's take a look. Section 2A only defines restricting in reference to funding, whereas Section 2B only defines censoring as cancellation. Notice, if a library does not want to cancel or does not want to provide funding, but they have to under this bill, they can still filter content to make it harder for families and students to get into. That is a huge problem. The American Library Association in 2020 found many libraries use internet filters to restrict targeted categories of information, such as family planning, while technically still providing access to it. So representatives on the affirmative, you have to remember, because of these loopholes, libraries who don't want to offer this content can still hide it from the people who need it the most. So Representative Brombaut, when you impact to family planning, unfortunately, this legislation is not enough. And then on the topic of state laws versus federal laws, the affirmative has blatantly misinterpreted how state versus federal laws work. You can't just say because we passed this legislation, immediately every single state and local law is gone. That's not how it works. There's a reason why marijuana is still legal on the state level and illegal on the federal level. It's because they inherently conflict. But let's actually examine the impact of that. The study by John Helling from Purdue University on January 16th of 2020 found that federal funding only makes up 0.4% of a library's funding on average, which is actually in contrary to Representative Yee and Representative Wadwa. But let's examine state and local funding, which that same study found made up 82.7% of the average library's funding. If you want a library to adhere to our legislation and not a state's legislation, guess what? They just lost all of their funding and all of the services the affirmative wants to propagate up, they're gone. Second, LGBT services and how we impact this youth. I'm very surprised the affirmative keeps bringing this up because they've lost this debate the entire time. Representative Jawar was the only senator in this entire round to provide any quantification on this topic, telling us 60% of LGBT youth experience these ideas at under the age of 12, and 1/3 of them fear being rejected. That statistic wins this debate, and ultimately the affirmative wins this, or the negative wins this debate as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for a minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Between those, it goes to Senator Yee.
Hi, Senator Yee.
Library is going to restrict programming if that has nothing to do with online databases.
What do you mean? Like, what do you mean? Like,
So you talked about how like libraries will like find loopholes with online databases and like kind of like skew with the search engine.
So
What
in the
happens with
status
programming?
quo, there are a lot of libraries who like have internet filters to restrict content such as family planning.
But I'm
This
talking about
legislation,
physical conversations and programming, having people come to the library to have a discussion.
and that's the problem with the state law argument the negative has brought up. State laws still restrict that from happening,
You're not
as brought up by
addressing my
Representative Posick on
Senator Wadwa.
Hi,
Hi,
Representative
Senator.
Wadwa.
So one of your biggest concerns was that many children are confused about their sexuality, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, so right now there's thousands of libraries across the United States that don't have that available in the status quo, right?
Well, the problem with that argument is you can't just say, oh, some libraries don't provide it, so it's a net positive. I'd argue
Sure,
libraries
but
who
this
do
isn't a
provide
net
it,
harm. Even if it's hard to access, at least it exists,
the
right?
libraries who already provide
Thank
it
you,
are
Senator
now going to be
Rodriguez. The
hurt
time for
under this
questioning has
legislation.
elapsed. You may take your seat. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Josephson.
I thank the chair. For my judges, that's Senator Josephson, spelled as if the man with the Technicolor Dreamcoat had a child who was a boy. Unless I hear otherwise, in a couple seconds, I'm gonna hope that all of my judges are ready, and then I'll begin. American treasure LeVar Burton once said that if you want to learn, take a look. It's in a book. And that's because so much of the information that our society contains is able to be found in libraries. And so Just as Senators Lynn and Valinsky agreed to a couple minutes ago, our ultimate goal in today's debate should be to pick the side that makes information available to as many people as possible. And it's only by analyzing all the arguments given today that we can realize that it's only the affirmation that makes information available. So first, let's take a look at some numbers. Senator Rodriguez was really excited to tell you that the only number being given about LGBTQ youth was that 60% of them are under the age of 12. But what he doesn't realize is that fundamentally, when people are under 12, in a few years, they'll be over 12. And that means that though they may be gay and under 12 now, in a few years, they'll be gay and over 12 and able to access almost all of this information without parental censorship. Senator Rodriguez, they're being censored in the status quo. So they won't stop being censored once we pass this bill, but they will stop being censored once they get over 12. But you lament the lack of numbers in this debate, so let's give you some more. We want to make sure that as many people as possible get access to more information. So let's turn to when Senator Yee talked about prison libraries. She's completely right that prison libraries are home to some of the worst censorship in the country. A 2019 report from the Penn Project said that prison libraries are the home to our nation's largest book bans. And that means that the 2.1 million Americans that are currently in our prison system aren't being given access to books. We want to expand to more than just sexual bans, though. So let's realize that despite the fact that nearly 2/3 of Georgia's inmates are Black, and that's a problem in and of itself, but despite that fact, none of them have access to books written by Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, or Nelson Mandela, only because those three have all been convicted of crimes in the past. We need to realize that it's only by passing this bill that we can make sure they're able to get the information they need in order to reduce recidivism rates and make sure that they're able to protect themselves from the dangers that society forces onto them. How are we supposed to educate prisoners and reduce recidivism when the draconian prison library censorship is standing in the way? The answer is by passing this bill. So let's take a moment and ask ourselves, why is it that so many people in our prisons and so many people across the country aren't being given access to this information? And the answer fundamentally comes down to the beliefs and ideas of what people think is right. But we need to realize that our questions of morality don't apply here, because the First Amendment tells us that whether we agree with people or whether we don't, it is fundamentally wrong for the government to restrict speech. That's something nobody's realized, and that's because when any state or any federal government passes bills that stop people from getting things because they think it's wrong, that's wrong. When all of you are asking questions about how to help people get the most information possible, take a look, it's in the bill. Pass.
Thank you, Mr. Josephson, for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Before we move into questioning, Senator Rodriguez, your point of personal privilege is granted. With that, we're now in 1 minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please rise. That goes to Senator Khan.
Hi, Senator. I'm confused as to why you believe texts by Black leaders are restricted in our libraries.
So I can send you the link after round, but the idea is basically in penitentiaries all across the country, books are being banned because of the past criminal.
Why? Isn't the current law for libraries say that you can only ban that were like some things that were restricted sexually or something like that?
No, if you look at section 1, it said the final criteria is criminal status of the subject or author. You can pull up the bill and double check. Because when we pass this bill, we take literature that's currently inaccessible and make it accessible.
But how does that mean?
Senator Holtzik.
Thank you. Great speech, Senator. So do you agree with me in that in the status quo, libraries are underfunded?
Well, so the thing is, if you look at prison libraries, they get hundreds of billions of dollars from the federal government, right? I'm
Not
sorry?
just in general, are libraries underfunded? Could they use more money?
I'm always in favor of giving libraries more money.
Where in the bill does it provide the tens of thousands of dollars necessary to protect the speakers we're mandating these libraries have?
So it's actually the Bill of Rights that protects speakers that people don't
No, it
agree
doesn't.
with, right?
Actually,
Have you read the First Amendment?
says that they're responsible.
Thank you, Senator Josephson. The time for questioning is lapsed. You may take your seat. Two brief reminders. First, the hard stop for this round is at 5:30 p.m., about 1 hour and 15 minutes from now. And second, if you choose to exit the chamber through a point of personal privilege, I will only be allowing 2 people maximum out at once. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Burkhart.
I think the chair, that's Senator Burkhart speaking for the first time, probably the last on this piece of legislation. Any indication of when to begin, much appreciated. Perfect. Great. Now we've heard about what reading and the benefits it can bring us throughout today's debate. And one benefit that reading brought me was looking at today's piece of legislation, the Regulations Upholding Protection Across the United States Libraries Act. And I realized it was the RuPaul Act. But quite frankly, when looking at today's piece of legislation, I think RuPaul would be quite disappointed, because when we take the act at their highest ground, understand today's piece of legislation doesn't do anything to benefit LGBTQ youth throughout the United States. So let's first examine two scenarios that are going to happen under today's piece of legislation, and ultimately why the negation wins on these. So I'd like to examine this idea of funding, and because funding is the biggest predicate for accessing any of the impacts that we're going to see on the affirmation of today's debate. Now first, I'd like to examine how funding is ultimately going to lead to a decrease in these services that the affirmation wants to espouse throughout today's debate. And this is because federal funding is a small percentage of libraries' funding. Now, Representative Rodriguez mentioned this, and this is furthered by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in their 2014 report, which says that public libraries receive a vast majority of their funding from the local government. The 2014 estimates put it at 86% of their funding comes from local government, states provide 7%, and the federal government provides less than 1%. So we're faced with a dilemma here. If states are seeing backlash against their libraries, what are they going to do? Dump the 86% of their funding that comes from these local sources, or dump the 1% of federal funding? Understand, as the Columbus Dispatch details in October 20th of 2019, public libraries like the Granville Public Library rely on levies. And the director of the library said that in order to ensure they have maintain funding, they need to maintain the public's trust, which is what she said. However, as Representative Polsky has told you, we see great public backlash as a result of this. So what are they going to do? They're going to prioritize and make sure that their communities are happy so they can maintain that 86% of funding. So they can, but ultimately, they're not going to prioritize that 1% of funding that comes from the federal government. But why exactly is this so detrimental? As the American Academy of Arts and Sciences 2014 report continues, that 1% of funding goes to technology. And the reason this is so important is because NBC News tells us in April 5th of 2020, one of the ways that LGBT youth are maintaining their identity and getting support during the coronavirus epidemic is through online resources. So even if there's censorship in these libraries, and representatives on the affirmation will say, well, can't they just go to the internet? Understand that the internet will not be able to be accessed because these federal funds that these libraries are going to forego in order to ensure that they maintain the public funding ultimately goes towards the technology, and the technology that allows these LGBT youth to get the support that they need. Fellow representatives, it seems we've gone through a race in today's piece of legislation. Well, ultimately, when we take a step back and look at the key facts and understand that funding is the single most important issue, and ultimately that it sides on the side of the negation, that the only thing you can do is truly honor RuPaul and negate today's piece of legislation.
Thank you, Senator Burkhart, for that speech of 2 minutes and 58 seconds. We'll now enter 1 minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Between those standing, that goes to Mr. Josephson.
I thank the chair. Senator, do you agree our goal should be to get access to as many people as possible?
Okay, yeah, but we're not going to see access to as many people as possible.
All right, wait. Do you know how many people are currently in federal prisons?
I don't currently know the statistics on that.
There's about 2.1 million Americans that are currently incarcerated. Do they have access to pretty much any literature right now?
Probably not, but I'm also saying that the largest...
You know how much federal funding state and federal prisons get?
No, I don't currently know, but I know that for public libraries, federal funding is a small amount.
Hi, Representative, I'm a little bit confused. What provision under this legislation is somehow cutting funding from libraries because of restrictions?
Well, what I'm saying is that federal funding accounts for a small percentage. So they're going to want to make sure that their locals are happy because the local community provides a majority of their funding. So they're going to appease the locals.
Okay, but how strong is backlash to the point where funding is even an issue when it comes to budget cuts?
Well, see, there are these things called levies that come up in order to ensure the funding, and the levies go to the public community.
Seeing no further motion, the speaker may be seated. Mr. Bogan, a motion.
I move to previous question.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Assuming unanimous consent so ordered, we are now in voting procedure. All those wishing to pass today's legislation, please hold your placard to the screen like this so I can state your name so we make sure we have a correct vote count. Senator Yee, Lynn, Bogan, Brombot, Josephson, Wadawa, Khan, O'Leary, 8. All those wishing to fail, please hold your placard to the screen. Senators Ma, Paltzik, Lahiri, Velyunsky, Rodriguez, Burkhart, Mazumdar, Jawar. On a vote of 8-8 per TOC procedures, it is in the role of the presiding officer to break the tie. I choose to fail today's legislation. Mr. Bogan, a motion?
I move for a 5-minute recess.
Is there a second? Any opposed? Assuming unanimous consent so ordered, please be back here by 4:28 p.m. promptly.
Yo, on Kiru, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How many questions do I have in?
How many questions do you have, Mr. Lin?
Yeah.
You have the second most, and you have the fourth best recency on questions.
Okay. How many questions is that?
2 questions.
Can I,
Two
can I
questions
ask
is-
the same question?
Oh.
Sorry,
Yes,
sorry.
Senator Lahiri. Okay, you have 2 questions, but you have the best recency in the round.
Okay, thank
So
you.
next time you raise your placard, you'll get the question.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, dude.
No worries. Yes, Senator Yi. You have 3 questions, but you were the first person to reach 3 questions.
Okay.
So you have the 4th to worst recency.
Gotcha.
How about my questioning recency and precedence?
Yes, Mr. O'Leary, you spoke 9th on the last bill, so about middle round. And on questioning, since you just gave the last question, you now have 3 questions in the worst recency in the room.
Okay, thank you.
No worries at all.
Thank you.
A reminder for the chamber, there's 1 minute remaining in recess number 1. The time is now 4:28 and our first recess is over. I'd ask all participants to please turn on their cameras. We're still waiting on one judge, so we'll let them trickle in. Thank you.
Speech
All right.
just came out, so I was getting a call from a student.
No worries at all. At 4:28 p.m., the session is back into order. We left off on the last bill, which we failed on a vote of 8-9. Now we are entering debate on Bill SF2A, or a bill to protect controversial speakers at higher education institutions. Is there an authorship? Is there a sponsorship? Is there a sponsorship speech on this bill? A first for Ms. Senator Josephson. Senator Josephson, did you raise your placard for a sponsorship speech?
No, but I'll take it.
Oh, thank you very much.
Anything for the flow debate. I wasn't totally sure I'd get a second speech this round, but it looks like I will. Everybody, please let me know if you're not ready. Otherwise, in a moment, I will begin. Every morning in classrooms across the country, students recite the words that they'll be bound by forever. They swear to uphold liberty and justice for all. But let's make sure that we don't get blinded by these buzzwords and focus on how we can actually protect speakers and free speech all across the country. So first, let's take a look at what happens in the status quo and why certain problems exist. On college campuses all across the country, speakers are being unnecessarily regulated based only on their points of view. And this isn't a partisan issue. It happens on both sides of the aisle. On December 2017, an incredibly valuable member of our society was banned from speaking at Harvard University simply because of her views. Her name was Chelsea Manning. It's not because it's not because of her ideas, or rather, it's not because of any substantive value that her invitation to speak got revoked, but only because the university disagreed with the information that she wanted to give. It's this same type of thing that happened at the University of the other universities all across the country. For example, we can look to UC Berkeley in 2010, or rather in 2017, when we saw all sorts of people that had speeches to give, but were then denied those speeches simply because people at the university didn't feel comfortable hearing them speak. I don't know if my fellow senators have read the First Amendment, but it tells us that the ability to give speeches may not be limited simply because we disagree. Now, of course, it's legal to discriminate, or it's okay to change time and manner, but instead of simply moving these speakers to auditoriums where they'll be safer, some speakers get disinvited altogether. But this is where my bill is able to produce fundamental positive change. And that's because in Section 2, we establish a task force that's able to investigate First Amendment freedom of speech violations against colleges that disinvite controversial speakers. Now, keep in mind, we're not just talking about student protests or people who say things that we don't agree with. We're talking about universities that decide to invite someone and then change their minds only because of controversy. Now, this task force contains enough people that we're able to make informed decisions and that will be able to cross partisan lines. People like the Attorney General aren't picked because of partisan politics, but because of legal experience. And so I'm comfortable in telling you that this task force will be able to protect free speech across our country. Ultimately, we need to remember that our goal as Americans and our goal as senators is to protect free speech and to protect the liberty and justice that we hold so dear. So let's remember that we can't tip the scales of justice to either side. Let's make sure that no universities are able to deny free speech to anybody. And let's pass my bill.
Thank you, Senator Josephson, for that speech and sponsorship. At 3 minutes and 9 seconds, we will now enter 2 minutes of mandatory questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Lahiri.
Thank you. Great speech. So I have a quick question. So you say that the universities no longer determine whether they can't get rid of the person who's coming to speak. Doesn't the task force just take on that role now?
No. So what happens is the universities say that they can't have people come speak only because of controversy.
Okay.
Our
Okay,
task-
understood.
Mhm.
So doesn't the task force just decide selectively which universities to investigate?
No, I see you might think this
Why?
task force is going to be partisan, but they lose their partisan affiliation once they get onto this committee.
Senator Mazumdar.
How?
Because
Alright,
they're
let's
not
talk
appointed
about
for
the-
life, or because they are appointed. Their jobs aren't at the mercy of other people. Sorry, Senator Mazumdar.
Okay, glad that you can make time for me. So let's talk about who appoints the Attorney General. Who is
Yeah.
that specifically?
That's the president.
Right. Unfortunately, he's part of a faction, is he not?
Yeah, but the thing is that faction's going to change every 4 years, every 8 years.
Regardless of the party that the president is, isn't the Attorney General appointed by a partisan member?
The Attorney General is appointed by a partisan member.
Exactly. So
so is
won't the
everyone
Attorney
else
General
in
in
government.
turn appoint a partisan task force?
I hate to break it to you, Senator, but almost everybody in this government is partisan somehow. By
Why
making
can't
sure
we
we
have
have
an
more
industry
people in the
leader
task
or a
force,
university
we'll
who are not
counteract
Senator Lynn.
Okay, thank you. You just conceded that this task force would likely be partisan. Is it a good idea to give a partisan task force the power to regulate free speech on college campuses?
First of all, in the status quo, nobody has the ability to effectively regulate and put checks on free speech violations on college campuses. At least when we pass my bill, we're able to more effectively regulate violations.
Who is more able to regulate violations? One side?
You assume that this task force will pick and choose selectively.
Senator Bogan.
That's false.
Hi, so how are controversial speakers actually invited to universities?
The office of the university says, hey, please
Actually
come.
false. It's student groups and clubs. So how is this not a legitimate decision by the university to deny them?
Well, so the fact of the matter is, controversy isn't something that should be decided by random people. Controversy is the type of thing that's more objective and needs to be
status quo.
Yeah,
Because
I know, but under my bill, we're able to more effectively regulate it.
the universities are denying
Thank you,
them.
Senator Josephson, for that speech and sponsorship. The time for questioning has elapsed. You may take your seat. That was the first speech and affirmation. We're now in line for first speech and negation. Negative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Khan, unopposed.
I thank the chair. As always, any indication of when my judges are ready? Good, good. All right, looks like we're good here. I want to be able to see the PO. When it comes to education in this Congress, we talk more about how to keep our students safe than we do curriculum, funding, and resources. This debate is no different. Schools should always prioritize learning, especially when it comes to teaching tolerance. But a few new ideas from a speaker are not worth even the smallest amount of disruption or violence in response. Don't punish universities for trying to keep students and speakers safe. Let this Congress understand why colleges reject speakers in the first place. First is because of a cost factor when inviting speakers who are controversial. This cost stems from the damage to the area during the speech. Jillian Berman explains from Market Watch on March 5th of 2019 that the University of California spent roughly $4.8 million on security in 2017 surrounding appearances from controversial speakers. People like Ben Shapiro, who were invited by student groups according to the university, were a part of the responsibility in this cost. And the University of Florida spent $500,000 to keep its campus safe when white nationalist Richard Spencer appeared there in 2017. What you see is a repeating pattern of how colleges have to pay for prices of security when trying to invite controversial speakers. Colleges turn away these speakers for the cost damage. That's why, Representative Josephson, colleges mainly turn away these speakers. I fully agree. People should have the right to speak freely. But if you have to weigh safety over their right to speak, I think all of us can agree, even for the speaker, that safety is more important. But the second factor for rejections are trying to keep the safety of everyone present at that assembly. Speakers rile up crowds, which in turn leads to physical harm. The impact is more deeply explained by the Washington Examiner on September 19th of 2017. That nearly 1 out of 5 college students believe it's acceptable for a student group to use violence to silence a controversial speaker at an on-campus event. The survey from John Wilsonar, a Ron resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, sheds light on college students' attitudes toward an understanding of the First Amendment. Recently, controversial and conservative speakers scheduled to speak on college campuses nationwide have faced opposition and even violent protests, causing some universities to cancel their appearances. According to the survey, a non-residential senior fellow found that the students polled said they believe it's acceptable for them to be hurt. It is necessary for this Congress to understand that with these stipulations, Congress should not try to accuse them of harm by a biased task force coming after them. Instead, of violating the First Amendment. Colleges are just protecting everyone. That is something that we have to understand for the rest of today's debate. Do not create a task force that may incentivize them into choosing to allow a speaker. Even with the destruction it entails, you're going to be negating on the premise of safety. Safety is the impact that's going to outweigh anything that the affirmative is going to prove. The burden is to prove that the people's safety is not more important than their impact. Negate.
For the purpose of the judges, the time of that speech was 3 minutes exactly. We will now enter 2 minutes of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Rodriguez.
Hi, so these colleges, as you said, are like often rejecting speakers because of these cost issues, right? So if this task force,
and then there's security issues as well.
Right, so if this task force finds out that's the reason why, what is the actual harm to these colleges?
No, so here's the thing. They reject them before you can even find out that that's the reason why. So what happens is it'll happen and they'll say it's rejected, but the task force either A, wouldn't accomplish anything or would falsely reject him on the basis.
But if the college just tells the task force that, why is that a net negative?
Senator Jawar.
Hi, Senator. Do most high schoolers think it's okay for you to use violence against a speaker?
No, absolutely not. And neither does that
So you tell us that a lot of college students do. What changes in between high school and
I
college?
didn't say most. There's still a significant proportion. And it's about the fact that they get riled up in the moment and they do feel a harsh.
Okay, once these universities start protecting the speakers, does that not change the culture at the colleges that this is okay?
I mean, right now we can pass legislation that further.
So you said that colleges disinvite speakers because they think that their security is going to be too expensive, correct?
That is the reason, yes.
Okay, so if these clubs are the ones that are largely inviting these speakers, aren't they the ones who get the funds to actually have these speakers come and speak?
Right, but they don't pay for the security costs because they don't really care about the security costs. It's more of the college's success.
But don't they have to actually have the speaker come speak at their college as part of regulation?
Right, but part of the problem is the college doesn't make those clubs pay
Senator
for
Ma.
the security costs.
Hi, Senator. So what's the reason that a lot of universities still do, despite the exorbitant costs, they still invite these speakers? What's the reason?
Well, they want to hear their opinions, of course.
Okay, but isn't there also a Supreme Court precedent that colleges have to pay for the security to protect the free speech of these speakers?
So there's the problem. Can you elaborate more?
Like, is there not already a Supreme Court precedent mandating that has to happen?
Okay, so right now the colleges either don't pay.
Like, isn't this argument like non?
Thank you, Senator Khan. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was a speech to the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Between Senator Rodriguez, Senator Bogan, and Senator Palcic. That goes to Senator Bogan.
I think the chair for the judges, that's Jonathan Bogan, spelled B-O-G-E-N, speaking for the second time this session on the affirmation of this legislation. If it helps, I was the 5th speaker on the last bill. I'm now at the leisure of my judges whenever you guys are ready. All right, good, good and good. All right. The list of bad words is constantly changing. During the era of the Romans, it was an egregious offense to comment on one's economic status. In the Revolutionary Age, terms like tyranny and king were fired like the rounds of a rifle. But now, as words like bigot and snowflake make university halls shake, we must protect our freedom of speech before speech itself takes our freedoms for good. So let's start this dubious discourse. Pass this legislation to improve respectful debate by forcing schools to refine their speech codes. Michael Barrett of American Association of University Professors explains, university speech codes are centers of controversy. The debate between what constitutes free speech and marginalization is increasingly at odds. But this legislation signals a clear push towards greater free speech, meaning that when we pass this bill, universities will want to be as little restrictive as possible. That's really important for speech codes. As Markala Center for Applied Ethics writes in 2020, threatened by politically correct students who are backed by speech codes, students who have non-conforming points of view are afraid to speak in classes. This obstructs education that promotes tolerance and diversity in other ways. But when you pass today's legislation and force universities to clearly define what's tolerated and what's not, you allow people to speak out without fear of retribution from their peers. Furthermore, you increase communication and the likelihood of people compromising. Mr. Khan, if you don't want student bodies to violently shut down speakers or students, then that's a reason you pass this legislation. They can't attack others and claim that their feelings were hurt as a legitimate excuse. That's ultimately why you need to stand on the affirmation. But now let's change the focus from individual to institution. Pass this legislation to enhance campus security by providing new options for universities to weaken the cost burdens of hosting controversial speakers. Cole Behrens of the John Marshall Law School finds on January 29th of 2020 that state legislatures that prohibit universities from canceling controversial speakers, like Ohio's, have worked to allow the state government to subsidize security costs associated with their attendance. Mr. Khan, you're really worried about that very cost. But with this legislation, you promote a precedent that not only lowers the burden, but makes it disappear entirely. It's a net benefit for universities. But that assurance of adequate law enforcement is vital for universities across our country. Megan Shalong of the California Polytechnic State University writes on September 13th of 2017 that colleges are forced to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to host incendiary speakers. Even when campus police are present, crowd control is difficult, and a conflict could lead to unintentional deaths. So when you pass this bill, you're not only protecting viewpoints, you're protecting countless lives in the process. And if you take it one step further, when by lowering the risk of violence on campus, you create a new openness for controversial speakers. It's really a win-win. Mr. Ma, you don't want colleges to pay because of a Supreme Court case, but if you want to change, then you pass this legislation to set a new precedent where colleges don't have to worry about it. Let's make one thing clear. Universities are for the exchange of ideas, not bullets. So in the end, whether my words are championed well into the future or found on the wrong side of history, at least I was able to make myself heard.
Thank you, Mr. Bogan, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds exactly. We're now in line for 2 blocks of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator O'Leary.
Hey, so what exactly is the goal of the task force under this legislation?
The goal of the task force is to ensure that the First Amendment is not suppressed.
Okay, the First Amendment isn't suppressed, but is that through investigation or something else like you talk about in your speech? Because I don't understand how funding for safety is going to be implemented.
So what happens is when state legislatures prohibited universities from stopping controversial speakers, the government worked to allow for the government to subsidize it because they realized how big the cost is. They already set the precedent, so when we pass today's legislation, we just facilitate it.
Wait, but exactly how is just task force investigation going to cause any kind of influence within the government?
Likely to cancel.
Senator Mazumdar on recency.
Thank you. So can you explain how the creation of this task force will increase campus security?
Because when universities are less likely to release controversial speakers, the government will work with them to ensure the costs are subsidized and people don't lose their lives.
Why would they be less likely? Won't they want to increase their number of controversial speakers because now Congress has said they can?
That doesn't matter. We still subsidize their costs. Lives are saved.
But,
Ohio.
okay, you're promising that you're saving lives. Where in this bill do we increase funding for the task force?
The president has already said, I can't argue the validity of that.
Thank you, Senator Bogan. The time for questioning has elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. That was the speech in the affirmation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Between Senator Yi and Senator Ma, that goes to Senator Yi by 1 speech earlier in recency.
I thank the chair. I'm Representative Yi, spelled Y-E. As always, at the leisure of my judges and parley. I'm going to pin the PO real quick. Okay. Today, I come to you live from my bedroom. Even though I'm online, I'm still able to speak my opinion. But for many controversial speakers, they continue to be uninvited to speak at commencement events and other events on university campuses. Today's legislation creates a task force that determines if those speakers deserve the same right as me to speak our opinions. But because it's so flawed and draws members from the wrong offices, I won't even bother creating this task force. Fail. First, you fail because of Section 2A, which mandates that the Department of Education will appoint 9 members to the task force. But that's an issue when we look at how the Department of Education has dealt with lobbying from post-secondary institutions. Harry Murakami of Inside Higher Ed tells us just 2 months ago that a decade ago, Bucknell University was among 700 other higher education institutions and groups that spent about $100 million hiring lobbyists in Washington. Many of them hit up members of Congress for earmarks to pay for things like a new campus lab or a building. But this has dropped since we're no longer the ones making the executive decision on this funding. Instead, colleges are pushing their efforts to influence the US Department of Education at a time when agencies consider changes to policies around how campuses deals with allegations of sexual assault, harassment, and controversial commencement speakers. In today's debate, this is the point that will matter the most. It doesn't matter what this task force ends up deciding, the task force itself is flawed. We can no longer give power to a body that will continue to accept bribes from higher institutions who will always do their best to avoid litigation. If the task force follows the dollar sign, colleges are the ones who end up winning, not justice. Fail. But next, I want to address the main points on the affirmation and why you pass. Representative Josephson, I want to uphold liberty and justice for all too, but when we establish this task force, it's already a flawed decision because they're constantly lobbied by post-secondary education. The attorney education representatives only make up half of the task force, so that means post-secondary institutes inherently make up the other half. I'm not even talking about party lines. I'm just talking about lobbying that happens no matter what color this task force represents. Representative Bogan, you talk about the impacts of universities who will now allow more speakers and greater tolerance on campus, but realize that nothing will happen with this task force. They'll continue to work for whatever the institutions want. Campus security doesn't change. Colleges continue to uninvite speakers. I'm all for the First Amendment and for freedom of speech, but I believe this task force is not fully equipped to make fair and just decisions for our college student constituents. Fail.
Thank you, Senator Yee, for that speech of 2 minutes and 46 seconds. We'll now move into 2 blocks of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Burkhart.
Okay, so you mentioned that the Department of Education is being lobbied, right? Doesn't that just make up 9 members? Isn't there another 9 from the Attorney General that they appoint?
So I told you that that's basically half, and that means that higher institutions represent literally half of the task force that's going to investigate.
Okay, yeah, but if 9 vote for it, the higher education ones, and 9 vote against, is there going to be any consensus in any action? I don't see the problem there.
In Congress, when we have a tie, usually that just means it ends up failing.
But if they have to come to a majority,
on recency.
Hi, Representative. So if it's the students inviting controversial speakers and not the colleges themselves, why does lobbying matter?
Right, so for the colleges, they're the ones who are going to decide which speakers they want, because at the end of the day, it depends on how much it costs for them to hire security. It doesn't matter what the students say. At the end of the day, college and higher institutions, they're the ones with the final say.
Are they lobbying specifically about speakers? Why does this matter so much to colleges?
Thank you, Senator Yee. The time for questioning is elapsed. You may take your seat. That was a speech in the negation. We're now in line for an affirmative speech. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. On recency, that goes to Senator Brombett.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon again. That's Senator Brombatt, spelled B-R-A-H-M-B-H-A-T-T. Any indication? Patrick Henry at the Second Virginia Convention begged this Congress to give him liberty or give him death, in reference to sending troops during the Revolutionary War. And since then, we've seen an abounding amount of viewpoints and ideologies stand on this floor today. This nation was built on the ability to speak freely on issues that may spark controversy, which is why you must pass. First, because this legislation solves for the timing loopholes colleges take advantage of in the status quo. News reports in January of this year of a speaker who was disinvited by Middlebury University and then was invited back to speak after 3 years of staggered protest. We see this occurring at other universities like UCLA and UC Berkeley. This means that pushback from the student body will almost always prompt a re-invitation. But this is where colleges get smart, because many controversial speakers, including Ben Shapiro and Ann Coulter, have accused universities of purposely scheduling their events at inconvenient times and locations in order to dampen their turnout. But those are 2 actors that have the ability to pay for million-dollar lawsuits against these universities. Not every speaker considered controversial has the ability to do that. So now they have 2 options. Either they, A, speak at a time where no one will be allowed to hear them anyway, or B, not speak at all. We solve for that problem under this legislation because now we have a solidified law that will assist a controversial speaker in the event that they sue a college for discriminating against them at a quiet time. Senators, we are only a democracy if you could keep it that way. Now, in questioning, Senator Mazumdar and Lynn asked the sponsor of this legislation if the task force ensuring everything I stated earlier is going to be partisan. But I'd like to remind you that partisan lines always shift, and we actually have both legislative and executive oversight under this legislation, because the House Committee is the only regulating agency for these executive agencies. Now that we've cleared up this fallacy, we can finally empower minority groups. Many universities tend to lean a certain way on social spectrums. Some are progressive, some are liberal, etc. But many of these universities, especially their sponsored media, do not portray the ideals of these minority groups, which essentially forces them to live in enclosed places with no acceptance of healthy discourse of their minority ideal. NPR in 2016 explains a 12-to-1 ratio for a majority versus minority ideal at universities. However, when we pass, we allow for minority groups to listen to outside speakers who advocate or build upon their pre-existing ideals, make them finally feel included in their university. History reminds us that we must not restrict opposing ideals, and we must invite discourse for progression.
Thank you, Senator Brombott, for that speech of 2 minutes and 48 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. If you wish to question, please raise your placard. Senator Yee.
Why will the task force help these speakers if they're being quietly lobbied by institutions that clearly don't want them?
Because these task force will be comprised of members of all different groups.
No, it's 9 from 2 different groups, and one of that entire group is
that will have both legislative and executive oversight to ensure that they're as diverse as possible, right?
Right, but they all come from the Department of Education, which serves the needs of these higher institutions.
Well, what other agency would handle this?
I'm just saying that this task force isn't going to work. They're not going to help these speakers that you talk
Senator
about.
Holtzik.
Oversight over it.
Great speech, Senator. So I'm a little confused. In your first point, you mentioned a university rescheduling a speaker for 3 years later, correct?
Sure, at Middlebury College.
Sure. Okay, so what happens if it's no longer safe for the speaker to attend the college? Are they
probably
canceling?
Then they probably won't attend, but this is based on the speaker's ideal. If they want to go, they can go.
But does that count as canceling if it prohibits the safety of people on the campus?
Well, that's
time for questions elapsed. Senator Brombott, you may take your seat. Senator Jawar, granted. That was a speech in the affirmation. We're now in line for a negative speech. All negative speakers, please raise your placard. Senator Ma, unopposed.
I thank the chair. Senator Ma, speaking for the second time this session, under the leadership of all those with me, just any sign when you're ready. All right. In her speech, Senator Brombott references Patrick Henry's ultimatum of liberty or death. But it's because of the fact that rather than upholding liberty, this legislation ensures its death, that we have no choice but to stand on the negation for 2 fundamental reasons. First, this legislation is a solution seeking a problem. And second, because this legislation's politicization of its task force enables the administration currently in power to prevent colleges from conducting critical speech and research. So first, let's understand that in the status quo, the problem that the affirmation speakers are so convinced exists is actually diminishing by the second. And that's because Jeffrey Adam Sachs from the Niskanen Center on January 25th of 2019 explains that the number of disinvitations has been falling significantly since 2016. In fact, in 2016, the number of attempts was 42, with around 20 being successful. But this past year, the number of disinvitations attempts fell to 9. And of those 9 attempted disinvitations, only 5 of them were actually successful. Let's understand that the reason why these disinvitation attempts are becoming less and less frequent and less successful is because colleges are realizing the fundamental nature behind the attempts to speak at the colleges in the first place. Because realize that colleges in the status quo are mandated by Supreme Court precedent to allow speakers to appear regardless of their views. Because Market Watch explains on March 5th of 2019 that legal precedent says colleges must cover security costs. Public universities have an obligation under the Constitution to allow speakers to appear on their campus regardless of their their views, according to Jeffrey J. Nolan, an attorney in Burlington, Vermont, who specializes in higher education law. They can put some restrictions on the event, like the place and the time, but public schools have an obligation to allow someone to appear even if it's likely to incite a disruption. And what this means is that after hundreds of lawsuits related to free speech occurred over the course of the past few years, colleges have started to realize that a lot of controversial speakers try to speak knowing they may be disinvited due to protests solely so they can sue the school and win. That's why there's such a significant drop in the amount of disinvitations over the past few years, meaning that this legislation is simply a solution looking for a problem. But what's more, there's actually a direct harm to passing this legislation. And that's because of something that's been alluded to in questioning before, which is the fact that this task force is going to be political. Because this legislation, because of its political nature and its weaponization of free speech, is going to enable the current administration to detract from colleges' ability to fund crucial research or to simply have the speech that they support. Because Ted Mitchell explains that referring to a Trump executive order along the same lines as this legislation, the president of the American Council on Education said that these sorts of protections are a solution in search of a problem that could lead to unwanted federal micromanagement of the cutting edge research that is critical to our nation's vitality and global leadership. And some theorize that the administration's desire to have the ability to investigate these institutions is the same ideology that causes him to label media as fake news. He wants political control over speech. Understand that the legislation simply isn't able to address these major concerns, and we have no choice but to negate.
Thank you, Mr. Mall, for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. We're now in line for direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Josephson.
Hey, Senator, you spend a lot of time talking about solutions that beg problems, but let's talk about a problem that needs a solution. Do you agree that we as a Congress have failed if there's even a single person whose civil rights and constitutional rights are violated?
I would argue that yes, and this legislation increases that number because it allows, okay, I understand that there's a committee that has oversight over this legislation.
Just not shook her head in disgust because I completely agree with her. Do you realize the number of people who are losing their ability to speak?
This legislation increases that because it weaponizes.
It decreases it because it establishes a task force that protects them.
And that task force is political.
Hi, Senator. So I understand that cases have been going down in recent years, but wouldn't this legislation just ensure that they never happen in the first place?
Okay, so the problem with that is because this legislation has a political nature that the fact that there's a House committee doesn't solve because the House committee can be the same party as the president.
What's the division like in the House committee? Like
the
between
House
Republicans
overall
and
is mostly Democratic, but there's no way to guarantee that
No,
that
I'm
one
talking about this
specific
specific
committee.
House committee. Do you know what the
you
division is?
Thank you, Senator Mall. The time for questioning is elapsed. You may take your seat. Mr. Jawar, granted. That was a speech in the negation. We're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Between Senator Palcic, Belyansky, Wadua, and Jawar, that goes to Senator Jawar on recency.
Thank you. For the judge's reference, that's Jawar. You heard from me once before. It's still spelled Jhawar. If I could just get a smaller nod from y'all. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. There is nothing more dangerous to democracy than a noisy minority silencing the majority. The great plight of American government over the past 2 decades has been getting Americans to voice their opinions in the first place. If we really want to solve that problem, it starts with legislation just like today's. The fundamental question in this debate hasn't been whether controversial speakers should be allowed in the first place or not. It seems like both the affirmation and negation are in agreement that freedom of speech is important on campuses. However, the negation begs the question of how we plan on protecting these speakers in the first place and making sure that every single case gets investigated. Those are the 2 questions I will answer in this speech. The primary reason you have to pass this legislation is that a small minority of students are controlling college campuses. An October 11, 2017 survey funded by the John Templeton Foundation finds that less than 2% of all college students would ever protest to stop a speaker from coming or do something to inhibit a speaker on campus. It is a very small minority of students that are controlling the situation at these schools. In a country that prides itself on freedom of speech and in a chamber built on debate, it is high time we stop telling those whom we disagree with to shut up and instead tell them to step up. How does this legislation protect speakers? Sections 2 and 3B create a committee authorized to leverage federal funding over any school that refuses to protect speakers. Senator Yee, you say this task force will be partisan, but here's the thing. There is no way to be partisan here. If a speaker is disinvited, we will hear about it either through the media or from students who wanted to see the speaker. After that, every single disinvitation has to be investigated. There is no way that you can look into some universities and not others, because as soon as we hear about it, the committee has to look at it. Why is this important? First off, it provides students the broad education they want. Senator Bogan, this legislation isn't just about protecting minority opinions. This is what the majority wants. An October 11, 2017 survey by the Brookings Institute found that 93% of college students want to see a greater variety of speakers than what exists in the status quo. Senator Ma, that one statistic means that even if disinvitations are low, every single one that we stop matters. American students pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to universities. I think they should have at least some say in what they're being offered. But second, it promotes civil discourse. Senator Khan, you're worried about the same thing I am. 1 out of every 5 students believes it's okay to use violence against these speakers. But that is because of the current culture at colleges. In the status quo, students can just threaten violence and get away with it because the college disinvites the speaker. When you pass today's legislation and the speakers are protected, it gives them a wake-up call. If there's one thing this Congress should protect, it's debate.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Khan.
Hi, Senator. So it seems that we're concerned about the same thing, safety, right? But how does this bill provide any solvency to protecting the speaker?
Because that's the thing, right? The reason why these students are turning violent in the first place is because the current culture allows them to, which is that, oh, if you threaten to turn violent, the speaker's going to get disinvited. After you pass this legislation, what you do is you change that culture.
How does creating a task force change that culture and necessarily mean that you're going
Because
to have
every time the institution disinvites someone, they lose federal funding. So now the institution cracks down.
Senator Lahiri.
Thank you. Great speech. So the legislation only applies to stopping disinvitations, right?
Yeah.
So why wouldn't colleges just stop the invitation from occurring in the first place?
Because the colleges want to see the speakers speak, considering 93% of their students
Wait. If colleges want to hear the speakers speak, why would they disinvite them in the first place?
All of these
It's a
students
really cyclical argument,
all of these
right?
students are making empty threats.
Wait, how are they making empty threats?
Thank
The
you,
argument
Senator
is that
Duval,
why
for
wouldn't
that.
colleges just
Time for questions
overregulate?
elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may be seated. That was a speech in the affirmation negation speakers. Please raise your placards. Senator Lin.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber, once again, Senator Lin, L-I-N, affirmation.
If it helped, Senator Lin spoke first on the last bill.
Yep. All right, anyone not ready? Great. One of my friends from China once told me that China has the best free speech out of any country. And I asked him, how do you know that? And he said, because here no one says otherwise. Now, Senator Bogan, Josephson, Brambach, and Jawar on the affirmation, and Senator Khan, Ma, and Yee on the negation agree that we need to maximize free speech and improve social discourse. So how do we do that? The debate so far has revolved around 2 questions, the Constitution and the colleges. Let's address both. First question, how will this affect the Constitution? Now, Senator Josephson and Jawar argue that the task force will uphold free speech. But within the first questioning block, Senator Josephson conceded that the task force would likely be partisan. Senator Yee and Ma hammered in this point. When we give wide executive discretion to choose speakers, there's an obvious outcome. The president will appoint a kangaroo court task force that agrees with this ideology. If you don't believe me, believe David Cole from The Nation. Trump said that he would open up libel law so that newspapers could be more easily be sued. He regularly attacks the press. So this question of free speech is such a tough question. We're having a lot of trouble with it. I wonder if someone has thought about it. Oh yeah, the court system. They've been ruling on it since 1789. According to the Bill of Rights Institute's legal page, There's Tinker v. Des Moines. There's Morse v. Frederick, which is a very interesting case I recommend for all of you. These are all legal precedents which deal with this question. Now, Senator Brombach thinks that the House implementation creates compromise, but the positions are still being filled by executive appointed positions. Daniel Ratcliffe's appointment for the DNI is evidence enough that Trump would fill these up with politicized positions. All in all, it's funny seeing us career politicians trying to use constitutional law interpretation to justify using the executive branch to interpret free speech. From checks and balances to balancing checkbooks, oh my gosh, what a mess. But the second question is, how will this affect colleges? Now, Senator Bogan and Jawar spearhead the affirmation's most crucial point, that the bill increases compromise and communication due to more speakers. But the issue is that this bill not only blocks people from disinviting speakers. So why is that bad? Senator Lahiri just brought this up in questioning. According to Kate Riley in 2017, campus protests at Berkeley and Middlebury were very extreme. Senator Khan cited how this is often violent and expensive. Colleges are already on the brink of just canceling speaker events in the first place. This bill actually stifles free speech. On top of Senator Khan's impact of campus safety, colleges might just give up on inviting speakers altogether. At the end of the day, it seems pretty obvious. Centralizing power will never improve free speech. Although I might be a Democrat and you might be a Republican, we can all agree that free speech regulation needs to be unbiased in order to uphold the First Amendment. After all, this is not an issue of red versus blue. It's a question of red, white, and blue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lund, for that speech of 2 minutes and 55 seconds. We'll now move into direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise their placards. Senator Bogan.
What's up? You're muted.
How are controversial speakers invited in the first place?
So often it's these campus organizations, but colleges might just dismantle them altogether. I mean, these events are fiascos.
Student organizations when they have a right to association.
Well, these colleges have been undergoing these violent protests for quite a while, and I assume they wouldn't want to go through them again.
College campuses aren't supreme to the Constitution. They have the right of association. These bodies can't be dismantled.
I mean, Middlebury is already considering just canceling invitations in the first place.
Because of the fact.
Senator Rodriguez.
Hi, Mr. Lin. Let's go off that last line of questioning. So if these violent protests have been happening for such a long time in these colleges, haven't really stopped people from inviting controversial speakers, why would that change with this legislation?
I mean, I think that's a misleading question. Violent protests are not the new normal. Colleges still hate it, and they're still going to try to make sure it doesn't happen.
But if students are the ones inviting these speakers, how can they prevent controversial speakers from
Their
coming to
organizations can get banned in the first place.
How is that possible, though?
Thank you, Senator Lund. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. As a reminder for the chamber, there is 20 minutes before a hard stop, meaning 4 to 5 speeches remaining in the session. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmative speakers, please rise. Between Senator Paltzik, Wadwa, and Valinsky, it goes to Senator Wadwa on recency.
I thank the chair.
And Senator Johnson, granted.
For the judges and chambers reference, I'm Senator Wadwa. That's spelled W-A-D-H-W-A. Just a thumbs up when you're ready, please.
She spoke 7th on the last bill, if that helps.
Thank you. Is Madam Parley ready? Thank you. As I look into my Zoom grid view, I'm proud that over 50% of this chamber itself is comprised of minorities. But what we need to do is take a step back from this legislation and realize which constituents it actually affects. And that's our minority constituents, which is why we affirm. But first, let's look at the most common negative arguments and see why exactly they fail in today's legislation. Senators Yi, Khan, Ma, and Lin all come up here and talk about how the task force will be biased. And honestly, I don't disagree. But I point you to Section 3 of today's legislation, where we say the House Committee on Education and the Workforce will oversee the enactment of this legislation. Senators, you claim that the task force will be biased, but refuse to understand the actual party split on this House committee. When asked in cross-examination to Senator Ma what the split was between Democrats and Republicans, he couldn't give me an answer, but allow me to. In this committee, we have 28 Democratic individuals and 22 Republicans. When we have 50 individuals engaging in active discourse, we are much more likely to reach an informed consensus regarding the infringement on free speech rather than when we don't have it. So while the task force has the potential to be biased, we still have a failsafe in place to protect against politicization. So that's not a problem. But second, Senators Khan and Lynn came up here and talked about how the security of speakers is far too expensive. But what they failed to realize is there are thousands of nonprofit organizations that provide funding for speaker security. In fact, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Challenge America grants provided over hundreds of thousands of dollars for speaker security in the last year alone. So what we need to understand is that grants exist for the speaker security. We just need to make sure that universities have access to them. But next, let's take a step back and look to the long-term effects of today's legislation. And that's that it protects faculty members. And that's true because free speech protections are critical for staff at these universities. In virtue of their heavy reliance on taxpayer funding and major donors, public colleges are much more receptive to calls from outside the university to punish faculty and staff for espousing controversial speech or ideas. This comes from groups like Professor Watchlist, Campus Reform, or Campus Watch that exploit this vulnerability and allow for bias in these systems themselves. But that's not all. The primary targets of these efforts end up being mostly women, people of color, and religious minorities. This legislation is essential right now because it is the first step towards protecting First Amendment rights as a whole on campus. This means that university professors will no longer be targeted because of their race or religion. Senators, we need to look at the long-term effects, not the short-term, and understand that today's legislation is the best way to protect the American people.
Thank you, Senator Waterwell, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Lynn.
Thank you. So how does House implementation make sure that the executive will implement fairly?
So what the House committee does is it oversees the enactment of the legislation. So if the task force attempts to be biased, they will make sure to counteract against that.
Okay, but that's like saying since my mom is tasked with making me eat vegetables, I'm going to eat my vegetables. I mean, that's not how it works, right?
Yes, but all legislation has enforcement. If we just claim enforcement will never work, then we will never pass legislation in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Ma.
So you're right that all legislation has enforcement, but can you tell me, like, on this legislation, what power the House Committee on Education and Workforce actually has on deciding which colleges the task force can investigate?
So the task force has to investigate every time a case comes up. So they have to investigate every college in which a case of infringement on free speech.
Where does it say that they have to investigate every single case? Because I don't see
It says
that
that in Section 1, Senator.
So, okay, so essentially they don't get to choose like what cases they.
Thank you, Senator Waterwell. The time for questioning is elapsed. Seeing no further motions, you may take your seat. Granted, Senator Josephson. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Between Senators O'Leary, Lahiri, and Mazumdar, that goes to Senator Mazumdar on recency.
Thanks. That's Mr. Mazumdar speaking for the last time today. Spelled M-A-Z-U-M-D-A-R, spoke second on the previous bill. Let me know when you're ready. All right, great. In many ways, this round is reminiscent of our nation's elite colleges. Mr. Ontiru graciously invites controversial speakers Khan and Ma, who provide bold new ideas, only to be shouted down by the opposing views of speakers Bogan and Brombaut in Cross-Ex. While we can argue freely without any fear of ramification, aside from a few bruised egos, in such a contentious debate, it's hard to keep a sense of clarity. When considering the full breadth of today's round, we see that the affirmation places a cost on free speech, and that is why you fail. Fail today's legislation, because in the affirmative world, we present colleges with two options: lose federal funding or risk your students' safety. Let's look at the last time the federal government tried to regulate campus speaking activities. President Trump threatened UC Berkeley's federal funding in March of last year to protect conservative speakers. In response, students protested, this time by violently rioting against far-right journalists and culture in November, which led to 6 arrests and several injuries. If colleges keep inviting controversial speakers because this bill approves of them doing so, student protests will inevitably follow, as they always have. But alongside massive student protests come massive security risks. Now, Ms. Wadwa and Mr. Bogan, both of you promised security grants to increase safety in the future. but Mr. Khan eloquently counters this with evidence from the present. He discussed the University of Florida, which spent hundreds of thousands of dollars for Richard Spencer's security. Eventually, the cost got too high. Megan Sillong from the USA Today in September of 2017 found that Ann Coulter's event, which I just mentioned at Berkeley, cost $600,000 in security alone. So the event was canceled. Mr. Jawar, we might protect speakers legally by passing this legislation, but we aren't protecting them physically when they're trying to speak. And so to ensure safety concerns and costs, colleges will cancel their speakers. But under this legislation, doing so means that they can be subject to the freedom of speech claims. And if the House committee finds them guilty, they will lose all of their federal funding under Section 3B, something that no one else has mentioned yet. Here's why Section 3B is such a problem. Brookings found on January 11th of 2017 that over 200 for-profit colleges run entirely on federal funding. That's not even counting public universities like Berkeley and the University of Florida, which according to education data from last semester, equals to nearly 75% of university students. For hundreds of colleges, federal funding is their lifeblood. We force those colleges to make a hard choice. They can invite all these new speakers, but students are going to protest. And to preserve their safety, they'll disinvite the speaker. But under this bill, when they do that, they have their federal funds threatened. So they're left with only one option: stop inviting controversial speakers at all. That deals a crippling blow to the status of free speech in the US. So Senators Josephson, Bogan, and Brumbaugh, you argue for the benefits of free speech, saying that we will invite controversy, increase ideological tolerance, and aid minorities. But in the spirit of student demonstration, I am protesting your link. When you pass, you eliminate any chance of free speech on campus because you force schools to choose between controversial speakers with massive security costs or federal funding loss, or not inviting them at all. Colleges will choose their students first. Fail this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Mazumdar, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Jawar.
Hi, Senator. What's the punishment in the status quo for a student that stops a speaker from coming?
Depending on whether that's violently or vocally.
Okay, yeah, either way. Do they get rescinded from the school?
If they cause a big enough scandal, then absolutely, or they'll just be arrested.
Yeah, but it depends on a big enough scandal. After you pass this legislation, do you think they're more likely to get rescinded from the school?
Great. Look, there should be a punishment for restricting free speech, but the punishment is not to pull all federal funding from a school.
Yeah, that's why the school will rescind the students so that way they don't lose all their federal funding. How does that not protect the speaker?
No, because it's not up to the school to decide the punishment. We decide.
Senator Brumbaugh.
Senator, if a controversial speaker really wants to sue or really wants to speak at the college, can't they just fund for their own security?
Okay, so what you're doing there is putting a price tag on free speech. I don't need to be a millionaire to speak on a college campus. It shouldn't be my onus to provide my security.
Give them the legal protection under this legislation to
Right,
ensure that
but
they
we
can.
need their physical protection in the short term because students are trying to violently riot against them. There's
Right,
nothing.
but what's the net harm?
Thank you, Senator Mazumdar. The time for questioning has elapsed. You may take your seat. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Between Senators Paltzik and O'Leary, Senator Paltzik on recency.
I thank the chair once again for my judges. That's Senator Paltzik, spelled Paltzik. If I could please get an indication from my judges when they're ready, that would be amazing.
Senator Paltzik spoke 8th on the last bill.
Yes. All right, I see one indication, another. Great. In 1946, Roger Baldwin, the founder of the ACLU, stated that in order to defend the people you like, you must defend the people you hate. To protect the rights of Americans, please pass this bill because it is a step forward in our grand journey to eliminating the core ideas of bigotry and hatred in 2 ways. So first, to every senator concerned about the rise of hate groups, violence, and safety, understand that the advocacy falls under the affirmative. First, pass this bill because it prevents hate speech from becoming more appealing. Vince Herron of the UCLA Law School finds that censoring certain expressions makes them more, rather than less attractive, simply by virtue of censorship. This leads to increased, not decreased use of the expression, and more injury, not less. Senator Khan, this is the change in culture. This is the solvency on the app. We fix the status quo, whereas the negative does not, because those driven underground are unable to attract attract new followers by holding themselves out to be a oppressed minority in their own way, whose truths are so powerful that they are banned by the establishment. The Southern Poverty Law Center explains that this is the very rhetoric that the KKK, Antifa, and other hate groups use to recruit and promote violence. Thus, by mandating that controversy is not banned, bigotry is exposed for what it is. Senator Khan and others, if you support this idea, you should stand on the affirmative to reduce bigotry as a whole. Now, the entirety of this debate has been about free speech versus hate speech, but understand that free speech itself stops hate speech, which is the second reason you must pass today's bill, because it stimulates the practice of argumentative counter speech, which is critical for reform. Charles Calleros, professor of law at Arizona State University, explains that free speech can be a powerful instrument of reform benefiting minorities as counter speech, whether in the form of discussions or demonstrations, and it exposes a moral bankruptcy of hateful ideas and spurs members of the campus to take voluntary action to combat hate and to remedy its ill effects. Either way, Senator Lee, these protests often result in the actions you want, not at all stifling free speech. Senator Mazumdar infers that protests always following these speeches are violent, but in most cases they're not. In fact, they are beneficial. For example, the campus community at Arizona State University in my home state constructively responded to a racist speaker, which spurred a campus revolution. A public rally was organized by a student African American coalition. A series of letters were written in the problem, and it added a course on American cultural diversity to the undergraduate requirement in order to combat this racism. This effective use of counter speech is not isolated at ASU, but used at hundreds of others of universities. Senator Yee and others, the only way to build grassroots movements that tear out the roots of bigotry and hatred is to hear and respond to it. This is the only way we address the concern of the affirmative and protect minorities while reducing hate groups. Pass this bill.
Thank you, Senator Palcic, for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. All those wishing to question for these two blocks, please raise your placards. Senator Velyunsky.
Hi. Hi, Representative. So you mentioned one positive example of counter speech, but how many negative examples have there been that put students at risk?
Sure. Okay. So I'm sure that the negation can bring up any example of negative uses of counter speech. However, in the majority of times, they're not only positive, but they're also constitutional rights, your right to protest.
So why is making it harder to disinvite speakers actually going to lead to more positive counter speech?
Well, first, as I explained in my first point, having counter speech exposes the ideas of bigotry. But second, if you're protesting in a violent, you're arrested. Hi.
Hi. So if universities are going to be hesitant to invite speakers at all when you pass this legislation, how are you helping free speech?
Well, that's not necessarily true. In fact, it proves that universities often more liberal, as many speakers behind me have explained.
So are they going to choose? So how can you ask them to balance federal funding over the safety of their students?
Well, if you let me finish my question, I would explain that it doesn't necessarily mean a reduction in safety. Rather,
Thank you, Senator Palcic. The time for questioning has elapsed. You may take your seat. At the discretion of the chair, this will be the final speech in today's round. That was in the affirmation. Negation speakers, please rise. Senator Lahiri.
I thank the chair for the reference of the chamber, that's Senator Lahiri, and I spoke sixth on the first piece of legislation, if that helps. I know everybody is really tired, so smile or nod when you're ready. Good, good. In our extremely polarized nation, two sides must sit calmly at the table and vocalize their concerns in order to come to an equitable agreement. However, overly controversial speakers usually don't desire to listen or even to sit. Instead, they often try to topple the table altogether. Unfortunately, this legislation is much the same, severely misguided and grossly myopic, so fail. This debate can be distilled into two nexus questions. The first is activism. Frankly, I'm appalled that thus far the debate has consisted of rehash over Mr. Josephson's original statement about a partisan task force selectively regulating, my colleague Ms. Yee's bribery concerns, and Mr. Jawar's argument about minority groups creating echo chambers. Allow me to assuage your concerns. Mr. Lin and Mr. Mazumdar, thank you for furthering my questioning, but your arguments about stopping speaker events only scratch the surface of the impact. The same Market Watch article that Mr. Khan reads at the beginning of this debate avers when this legislation gets enforced, colleges stifle student groups over platforms like social media, which is where protests get instigated in seconds. Inflammatory rhetoric, universities have to go to extreme measures, dissolving methods of online platforms altogether and pushing inflammatory rhetoric articulated by Mr. Jawar's minorities out of the space that Ms. Wadwa says is so pivotal. Ms. Paltzik explains that these universities that limit out free speech are unattractive. Unfortunately, underfunded, unsafe universities attract even fewer students, which greenlights this censorship. So Mr. Bogan and Mr. Brombot, this doesn't reform speech codes or uphold status quo polarization. It further restricts them because colleges see restricting in the first place as a more cost-effective way to preemptively address the task force, as Quillette notes in 2019. Mr. Jawar, you're right, democracy dies in darkness, but passing doesn't supplement school speech codes or society. It condemns students to silent servitude. The second reason you fail is because of the cost that Mr. Khan and Mazumdar bring up, but expensive is not an actual impact. Mr. Bogan and Ms. Wadwa, the problem here is neither public colleges or federal government can foot the bill for the passage of this legislation, let alone ramp up security, which would cost millions of dollars per school in the long run, which nonprofits can't cover since they were hit hardest due to the COVID recession. The implication is a trade-off with research capabilities. The Hill explains just 2 weeks ago that research universities like Berkeley and Harvard are on the forefront of medical breakthroughs that would assuage the COVID-19 pandemic and monitor future disasters. However, the article codifies that when universities lose revenue today and in the future, they have to cut from their research budgets because no other budgets, i.e. infrastructure, housing, and salaries, are as flexible. The sole impact here is affordable healthcare. Janssen Global explains in 2018 that every dollar decrease in medical innovation increases the cost of healthcare by $7. This evidence wins the round for the negative because in a time of COVID-19, we need healthcare more than anything else. We can make as many mistakes as we want on the negotiating table, but on the operating table, there are 0 second chances. I want my legacy to have a seat at the negotiation table. Don't push them to the floor and fail.
Thank you, Senator Lahiri, for that speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. We will now enter 2 blocks of direct questioning. All those wishing to question, please raise your placards. Senator Burkhart.
Okay, so you mentioned the costs during the COVID-19 epidemic, right? How many speakers are being invited to colleges and how many students are at colleges currently?
I'm sure you could tell me. Well, it's 0. It's 0, right?
Exactly. So how could you say that this is going to have any negative impact on colleges?
Well, the argument is that R&D capabilities drop in the long run, whether it's to innovate for COVID-19 or any future disasters that may arise.
Okay, but still, if it's affecting COVID-19 under the status quo, there's no college or there's no students there, right? So there's no speakers there,
Wait,
correct?
you're okay, but my argument is that when research capabilities decrease, that's
Senator
bad not
Josephson.
only for COVID-19, but for the future.
Senator,
Senator
let's
Josephson.
wrap everything up.
Hi.
Senator, let's
Okay.
wrap up this entire debate.
Sure.
Why do students have to pay for, or why do universities have to pay for security?
Because they want students to come to their school.
No, they have to pay for security when controversial speakers are there because of student threats, right? Why do students make threats?
Okay, so this goes back to my argument about how they limit social media platforms, which is where protests arise. Obviously, they don't want the protests, as you yourself have indicated, so they just get rid of the platforms altogether.
So isn't it true that when we pass...
Thank you,
the-
Senator Lahiri. The time for questioning is
Thank
elapsed. You may take your seat. At this point in time, we've reached a hard stop, which means that I, as the chair, am unilaterally calling for orders of the day. All those in favor of passing today's legislation, please hold your placard to the screen so I can read your name. Senator Bogan, Brombot, Rodriguez, Paltzik, Josephson, Volinsky, Wadawa, O'Leary, Burkhart, Jawar. 10. All those wishing to fail. Senator Yi, Ma, Lin, Lahiri, Mazumdar, Khan. 6. On a vote of 10 to 6, this bill does pass. Congratulations to the author. Today, we got through 64 questions. Every single senator here except for one got 4 questions, and including my own, we got through 30 speeches, despite the number of senators we have and the time constraint. Thank you very much for letting me serve as your presiding officer. Thank you to Mr. O'Leary for presiding the first session, and I'll hand it off to Madam Parliamentarian.
Sorry, I was having an issue unmuting. Thank you all so much. You did an excellent job adapting in this situation, and I appreciate being able to preside in your session. That was made really easy. My job as parliamentarian, not my job as deciding, because you all did such a great job, but I didn't have to intervene or do anything because our POs were great. So thank you both so much, and thank you all for competing in this venue. Congratulations to you all. Do you want to wrap up our session, Mr. Speaker?
Yes. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Mr. Bogan?
I call to adjourn.
Assuming unanimous consent. So ordered. Again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Congrats, everybody. Good job making it this far.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.